Welcome to the Unveiled Epoch Echoes channel. Today, we're diving deep into an unexplored historical mystery in the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where a man named emerged from the mists of a turbulent era, his life a tapestry woven with threads of genius, despair, and enigmatic discoveries that echo forgotten truths from ancient times, truths that perhaps trace back to the enigmatic scrolls of Byzantine mystics or the hidden rituals of Siberian shamans, long buried under layers of snow and secrecy, inviting us to unravel the enigma of a soul who peered into the abyss of human suffering and found glimmers of divine light, all while the winds of revolution whispered secrets that could reshape our understanding of fate, faith, and the eternal struggle between good and evil. As we journey through the life of this extraordinary figure, born on a crisp November day in 1821 in the bustling heart of Moscow, where the spires of the Kremlin loomed like silent guardians over a city teeming with merchants, serfs, and dreamers, entered the world as the second child of a stern army doctor whose rigid discipline masked a deeper torment, and Maria, a gentle woman whose warmth infused the family home with tales of folklore and fairy stories drawn from the vast Russian landscape. A home nestled curiously within the grounds of the hospital for the poor, where Young wandered among the afflicted, his wide eyes absorbing the raw humanity of the destitute patients, their groans and whispers planting the first seeds of his profound empathy for the downtrodden, seeds that would later bloom into the complex characters of his novels. But little did the boy know that hidden beneath the hospital's foundations lay of ancient catacombs, relics from Moscow's medieval past, where forgotten Orthodox monks had inscribed parchments speaking of predestined suffering as a path to redemption. Ideas that might have subtly seeped into the air he breathed, shaping his nascent in ways history has overlooked, as childhood unfolded in this peculiar blend of privilege and poverty, and his siblings were schooled at home by their mother, who read to them from the Bible and classic Russian literature, igniting a passion for words that burned brighter than the candles in their modest quarters. Yet tragedy lurked in the shadows when, at the tender age of 15, his beloved mother succumbed to tuberculosis, leaving a void that his father's increasing tyranny filled with harsh commands and unyielding expectations, pushing toward a military education that felt like chains upon his free spirit. And then, in a twist shrouded in mystery, his father met a violent end in 1839, murdered by his own serfs on their rural estate in a crime whispered to be retribution for his cruelty. But some hidden accounts suggest it was tied to a deeper conspiracy involving forbidden revolutionary pamphlets smuggled from ancient European dissident circles, pamphlets that echoed the rebellious spirits of medieval heretics who challenged divine authority, leaving Young orphaned and adrift, his inheritance squandered by relatives, forcing him to confront the fragility of life and the dark undercurrents of human resentment. Themes that would haunt his later works like spectral figures from a forgotten epoch, enrolling in the main engineering school in St. Petersburg, the imperial capital glittering with palaces and intrigue, endured the rigors of military training from 1838 to 1843, his mind wandering far from blueprints and fortifications to the realms of, and whose stories he devoured in secret. Graduating as a lieutenant engineer, but resigning his commission almost immediately to pursue the siren call of literature, a bold leap into uncertainty that marked the beginning of his literary odyssey. His debut novel Poor Folk in 1846 burst upon the scene like a revelation, hailed by critics as a masterpiece of social realism, portraying the plight of the urban poor with such poignant detail that it earned him instant fame among Russia's intellectual elite, drawing him into salons where radical ideas simmered like potions in an alchemist's lair. Yet success was fleeting, as subsequent works like The Double in 1846 and The Landlady in 1847 met with lukewarm reception, critics decrying their psychological complexity as overly bizarre, plunging into doubt and financial woes. But beneath this surface turmoil lay an unexplored layer of mystery, for during these years he delved into forbidden libraries, unearthing dusty tomes on ancient Gnostic philosophies that posited duality in the soul, good and evil entwined like serpents in Eden, ideas that perhaps influenced the motifs in his early tales, hidden inspirations from antiquity that added a mystical depth to his narratives, unnoticed by his contemporaries. As the 1840s drew to a close, his involvement with the Circle, a group of intellectuals discussing utopian socialism and reform, drew the watchful eye of Tsar Nicholas I's secret police, leading to his arrest in the dead of night on April 23, 1849, along with his comrades, imprisoned in the foreboding Peter and fortress, where echoes of past inquisitions seemed to whisper through the stone walls. He endured months of interrogation, unaware that the Circle's discussions touched upon revolutionary texts smuggled from France. Texts that traced their lineage to the enigmatic writings of medieval Cathars who preached a world divided between spiritual light and material darkness, a duality that would later infuse his explorations of morality. And then came the harrowing mock execution on December 22, 1849, a chilling spectacle on Square, Ware and his fellow prisoners were lined up before a firing squad, hooded and bound, the drums rolling as rifles aimed, only for a last-minute reprieve from the Tsar to commute their sentences to hard in Siberia, a psychological torment designed to break the spirit, yet for it became a pivotal rebirth, a brush with death that unveiled profound truths about suffering as a crucible for the soul, truths perhaps echoing ancient Stoic teachings buried in the annals of Roman history. As he was shackled and transporting to the frozen Exile of Omsk prison camp in 1850. Enduring 4 years of brutal among convicts whose stories of crime and redemption would populate his future masterpieces, the harsh Siberian winds carrying whispers of indigenous legends about spirits enduring eternal trials to achieve enlightenment, hidden folklore that might have seeped into his psyche during those long, desolate nights. Emerging from prison in 1854, transformed, his health shattered by epilepsy, seizures that struck like thunderbolts, often preceded by auras of ecstatic vision, which he later described as glimpses of paradise, served another 5 years in military exile in Semipalatinsk, where he fell in love with Maria, a married woman whose husband died, leading to their union in 1857, a marriage fraught with passion and pain, marked by her declining health and his growing gambling addiction, an obsession that began in the casinos of Europe during later travels, where he squandered fortunes in roulette's hypnotic spin, chasing elusive wins that mirrored the existential gambles in his novels. But amid this personal chaos, hidden discoveries awaited, for in Siberian archives he purportedly stumbled upon forgotten manuscripts from Orthodox hermits, texts linking Christian suffering to ancient Persian myths of resurrection through ordeal, inspirations that fueled his philosophical evolution, returning to St. Petersburg in 1859. Plunged back into literary life, co-founding journals like Time and Epoch with his brother, publishing House of the Dead in 1861-62, a memoir of prison life that exposed the humanity within criminals, shocking readers with its raw authenticity. Yet poverty dogged him, exacerbated by gambling debts, and the need to support extended family after his brother's death in 1864, the same year his wife Maria succumbed to tuberculosis, leaving him in grief's embrace, only to find solace in a whirlwind romance with his young stenographer Anna, whom he married in 1867, a union that brought stability amid storms as they fled creditors to Europe, where pennied crime and punishment in 1866, a gripping tale of murder and moral torment, weaving in psychological depths that probed the soul's capacity for redemption, ideas perhaps drawn from unexplored echoes of ancient Greek tragedies where hubris meets nemesis. Followed by The Gambler in 1866, dictated in a frenzy to meet deadlines, mirroring his own addictions, and The Idiot in 1869, portraying Prince's Christ-like innocence clashing with society's corruption. A narrative infused with themes of faith tested by suffering. Themes that might trace hidden roots to Byzantine hagiographies of saints enduring trials for spiritual purity as the 1870s dawned. Demons in 1872 unleashed a satirical storm on revolutionary nihilism, inspired by real political murders, revealing the dangers of ideology unchecked, while The Adolescent in 1875 explored youthful rebellion. But the crowning achievement came with The Brothers in 1880, a monumental epic of the siblings. The sensualist, Ivan the intellectual atheist, the spiritual seeker, grappling with patricide, free will, and God's existence. Its Grand Inquisitor chapter a philosophical tour force questioning faith's burdens, laced with mysterious undertones of ancient heretical debates from the Inquisition's shadows. Debates that challenge divine justice in ways history has half forgotten throughout these creations, philosophy crystallized. Suffering as a pathway to moral growth, faith as a defiant act amid doubt, morality not as abstract rules, but as lived struggles within the human heart, ideas that resonated with American readers across the ocean, evoking the pioneer spirit's endurance and the quest for individual truth. Yet his personal battles persisted, epilepsy's grip tightened, poverty's shadow loomed, gambling's allure beckoned, but Anna's steadfast support anchored him, allowing these works to flow like rivers from his tormented mind. In his final years, at last with the speech in 1880, where he extolled Russian literature's universal humanism, basked in acclaim, but health faltered, and on February 9, 1881, after a pulmonary, he passed away in St. Petersburg at age 59, mourned by thousands at his funeral, his legacy enduring as a beacon in world literature, influencing thinkers from his novels probing existential depths that continue to unveil hidden truths about the human condition, truths that link back to ancient mysteries of the soul's journey through darkness to light, a legacy that invites endless discovery, reminding us that in suffering lies the seed of profound insight. And as we reflect on this enigmatic life, we see how forgotten echoes from antiquity intertwined with his destiny, creating a narrative that transcends time. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the echoes of ancient Byzantine mystics mingled with the harsh winds of Siberian exile, a man named emerged from the mists of a turbulent era, his life a labyrinth of genius, despair, and enigmatic discoveries that whispered forgotten truths from the depths of time, truths perhaps inscribed in the lost scrolls of Tartar converts who bridged the golden horde's nomadic secrets with orthodox revelations, inviting us to unravel the enigma of a soul who gazed into the abyss of human suffering and unearthed glimmers of divine redemption, all while the undercurrents of revolution and fate swirled like hidden rivers beneath the frozen earth. As we embark on this cinematic journey through his existence, born on a crisp November day in 1821 in the bustling heart of Moscow, a city where the golden domes of churches pierced the smoky skies like beacons from a medieval past. Entered the world as the second child in a family of 7, his father a stern military surgeon at the hospital for the poor, a man whose Ukrainian roots traced back to the village of in what is now Belarus, bearing a coat of arms that hinted at Polish-Lithuanian nobility intertwined with mysterious Tartar ancestry from a defector from the Golden Horde in 1389 who converted to Christianity under Grand Prince. A lineage that perhaps infused blood with the nomadic spirit's restless quest for meaning, while his mother Maria, from a devout merchant family, brought a gentle piety that filled their modest apartment within the hospital grounds with warmth, reading to her children from the Bible and tales of Russian folklore, where heroes battled ancient forest spirits and sought enlightenment through trials, stories that planted the seeds of lifelong fascination with the soul's odyssey through darkness. Yet this childhood idyll was laced with shadows. As Young wandered the hospital wards, his sensitive eyes absorbing the anguish of the destitute patients, their wasted forms and whispered pleas echoing the forgotten sufferings of medieval serfs bound to the land. And in the summers at the family's rural estate inn, acquired by his father after ascending to noble rank in 1828 through Peter's reforms that blurred class lines like a mirage, roamed the fields and woods. Once terrified by a hallucinated wolf cry only to be comforted by a kindly serf named, an act of compassion that later surfaced in his writings as a symbol of innate human goodness buried under societal chains, a hidden truth perhaps drawn from ancient Slavic myths of guardian spirits in the wilderness. But tragedy soon cast its pall, when at age 15 in 1837, his beloved mother succumbed to tuberculosis, her frail body wasting away like the ephemeral beauty in verses he adored, leaving a void that his father's increasing authoritarianism filled with rigid discipline and unspoken torments, a father whose own demons, to include cruelty toward his serfs, culminated in a mysterious death in 1839, officially an apoplectic stroke, but whispered among villagers to be murder by enraged peasants, their retribution a dark echo of ancient uprisings like the rebellion, where bondsmen rose against their masters in blood-soaked quests for justice, a plot twist in his young life that later speculated fueled his epileptic seizures as manifestations of repressed guilt over patricidal wishes, though history veils the truth in layers of myth, leaving us to ponder if hidden diaries or suppressed estate records hold the key to this family enigma, orphaned and adrift with his siblings, and his brother were thrust into the rigid world of military education. Enrolling in 1838 at the Military Engineering Institute in St. Petersburg, the imperial capital aglow with opulent palaces and clandestine salons, where endured the drudgery of mathematics and fortifications, his mind escaping into the realms of literature, devouring works by Schiller, and earning the moniker Monk Photius for his reclusive piety amid the academy's debauchery. Graduating in 1843 as a lieutenant engineer, but resigning his commission in 1844 to chase the elusive muse of writing, a bold defiance against his prescribed path that mirrored the ancient Greek hero's rejection of fate, plunging him into poverty's grip as he translated for meager pay. Yet his debut novel Poor Folk in 1846 erupted like a revelation, an epistolary tale of destitute lovers in St. Petersburg's underbelly. Praised by critic as Russia's first social novel, catapulting into literary circles where radical ideas bubbled like alchemical elixirs, but success proved fleeting as The Double in 1846, a psychological story delving into madness and identity, met with criticism for its bizarre complexity, and subsequent works like The Landlady in 1847 and White Nights in 1848 garnered mixed acclaim. His early explorations perhaps subtly influenced by unexplored Gnostic texts he encountered in forbidden libraries, ancient writings positing the soul's duality as a spark of divine light trapped in material darkness, ideas that added mystical undercurrents to his narratives overlooked by contemporaries. Amid this literary flux, his involvement with the Circle from 1846, a utopian socialist group discussing Fourier's phalansteries and the abolition of serfdom, drew the ire of Tsar Nicholas I's secret police, especially after he joined a secret revolutionary splinter under, reading works like Atheist Letter to, leading to his arrest in the chill of April 23, 1849, imprisoned in the foreboding Peter and Fortress, where echoes of past inquisitions lingered like ghosts, enduring 8 months of solitary confinement and interrogation, a period that tested his spirit as profoundly as the ancient anchorites' desert trials, culminating in the harrowing mock execution on December 22, 1849, at Square, where hooded and bound before a firing squad, the drums thundering as rifles leveled, braced for oblivion only for a dramatic reprieve from the Tsar commuting the sentence to 4 years of hard in Siberia, a psychological crucifixion that reborn him, unveiling profound insights into suffering as salvation's fall. Perhaps echoing forgotten Stoic philosophies from Roman scrolls smuggled into Russian archives, as he was chained and exiled to the Omsk camp in January 1850, enduring 4 years of brutal toil among murderers and thieves, shackled in filth-ridden barracks infested with vermin. His only solace a smuggled New Testament that illuminated tales of redemption amid despair. Interactions with fellow inmates like the Polish noblemen and the compassionate Tartar, revealing hidden humanities. Stories that would infuse the House of the Dead in 1861-62, a semi-autobiographical of prison life's raw soul. While epilepsy seized him with ecstatic auras he described as paradisiacal glimpses, seizures that began around 1839 but intensified in Exile medical mysteries, perhaps linked to uncharted neurological inheritances or the trauma of his father's shadowy demise, emerging broken but transformed in 1854. Served 5 more years as a soldier in Semipalatinsk, befriending intellectuals like geographer and Kazakh ethnographer, whose tales of steppe nomads echoed his own ancestral Tartar whispers, falling into a passionate affair with Maria, a customs official's wife, marrying her in 1857 after her husband's death, a union marked by fervent love, yet plagued by her tuberculosis and his jealousy, their life in a brief respite before returning to St. Petersburg in 1859, where poverty and gambling's siren call ensnared him, an addiction that began in European casinos during 1862 travels, squandering fortunes at roulette in Wiesbaden and Baden-Baden, chasing illusory wins that mirrored the existential wagers in his novels, a compulsion perhaps rooted in ancient gambler's lore from Persian dice games, symbolizing fate's caprice. Amid these struggles, Maria's death in 1864 from consumption left him grief-stricken, compounded by his brother, demise that year, burdening him with family debts and guardianship. Yet from this nadir rose his literary phoenix, co-founding journals Time and Epoch to propagate, a philosophy blending with calls for unity between intelligentsia and peasantry, grounded in the soil of Russian orthodoxy, rejecting Western materialism, ideas perhaps subtly drawn from hidden Byzantine treatises on communal harmony, unearthed in monastic libraries. Publishing Winter Notes on Summer Impressions in 1863, critiquing European capitalism, and Notes from Underground in 1864, a novella heralded as existentialism's harbinger, where the antihero rails against rational egoism, probing free will's chaos, followed by the masterpiece Crime and Punishment in 1866, serialized amid financial desperation, chronicling axe murder and torturous redemption through suffering and love. Themes echoing ancient Judaic notions of atonement buried in Talmudic texts, dictated The Gambler in 1866 to meet deadlines, a frantic tale mirroring his addictions. Young stenographer Anna, whose efficiency and affection led to marriage in 1867, a stabilizing force as they fled creditors to Europe, enduring tragedies like daughter's infant death in 1868 from pneumonia in Geneva, yet birthing in 1869 in Dresden in 1871. And in 1875, who tragically died at 3 from epilepsy, heartbreaks that deepened his philosophical musings on innocent suffering as a path to faith, writing The Idiot in 1868-69, portraying Prince's Christ-like purity clashing with societal corruption. Inspired by Hans' Dead Christ painting, and perhaps forgotten hagiographies of Byzantine saints enduring worldly trials, then The Eternal Husband in 1870, Jealousy, and Demons in 1871-72, a satirical inferno on nihilistic revolutionaries based on the real murder, warning of ideology's demonic possession, ideas linked to ancient dualisms of light and darkness in the soul, returning to Russia in 1871, amid rising tension from gambling debts and health woes, including emphysema from Siberian chills, yet producing The Adolescent in 1875, a Bildungsroman of youthful turmoil. and a writer's diary from 1873-81, essays dissecting society's moral decay, his pan-Slavic fervor peaking during the 1877-78 Turkish War, advocating Orthodox unity against Ottoman threats, a climax in his public life with the 1880 speech at the monument, Unveiling, extolling Russian literature's humanistic universality, earning acclaim from liberals and conservatives alike, a triumphant plot twist amid declining health. As pulmonary weakened him, triggered perhaps by a family quarrel over inheritance or the stress of a neighbor's terrorist arrest, leading to his death on February 9, 1881, at age 59 in St. Petersburg, his final words quoting scripture on yielding to righteousness, buried at cemetery amid thousands mourning, his legacy a towering edifice influencing existentialists like Camus, psychoanalysts like who analyzed his parricidal themes, and writers from too. His works translated into 170 languages, with museums, stamps, and celestial namesakes, yet veiled in mysteries like his ambivalent views on Judaism, affairs, and the ecstatic nature of his seizures hinting at prophetic visions, reminding us that in the tapestry of his life, forgotten truths from antiquity, Gnostic dualities, Stoic endurance, Byzantine faith, interwove with the human drama, unveiling the soul's eternal quest through suffering to light. A narrative that transcends eras and invites endless contemplation. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the whispers of ancient Byzantine mystics intertwined with the relentless march of imperial autocracy, a man named navigated a life fraught with the raw edges of human existence, his story a mosaic of brilliance and brokenness that unearthed forgotten truths from the annals of time, truths perhaps etched in the cryptic runes of Scythian nomads or the veiled parables of early Christian ascetics hidden in monastic vaults, beckoning us to explore the depths of a soul forged in the fires of adversity, where suffering became the alchemist's stone turning despair into profound insight, as we delve deeper into this enigmatic tapestry, beginning with his birth on November 11, 1821, or October 30, by the old-style calendar, in the teeming metropolis of Moscow, a city where the gilded onion domes of Orthodox churches cast long shadows over cobblestone streets bustling with merchants, moujiks, and the occasional noble carriage arrived as the second of 7 children, too, a military surgeon of Lithuanian-Polish descent who had risen from humble clerical origins to serve at the hospital for the poor, a sprawling institution on the outskirts where the destitute sought solace amid the stench of illness and the moans of the afflicted, and Maria, a devout woman from a merchant family whose gentle piety infused their modest apartment within the hospital grounds with a warmth that contrasted the surrounding squalor, an environment that Young absorbed like a sponge, wandering the wards and gardens where he encountered the ragged humanity of beggars, alcoholics, and the terminally ill, their faces etched with stories of hardship that would later breathe life into the tormented protagonists of his novels. But beneath this visible world lay hidden layers of mystery, for the hospital's foundations rested upon ancient Muscovite earth to conceal catacombs from the time of troubles, where fugitive monks had scribbled eschatological visions of redemption through tribulation, ideas that might have subliminally shaped the boy's emerging as he played among the shadows, his early education unfolding at home under his mother's tutelage, who used the Bible to teach him reading and writing from the age of 4, instilling a deep reverence for scripture that would echo through his philosophical explorations, while evenings were filled with tales spun by his nanny, a storyteller of heroic sagas, fairy tales, and legends drawn from Slavic folklore, where forest spirits and wandering souls battled for moral supremacy, fostering in a lifelong love for narrative that blended the mundane with the mystical, and his parents introduced him to the works of Russian masters like, and, alongside foreign luminaries such as Homer, Schiller, and expanding his imagination beyond the hospital's confines, yet summers offered a respite at the family's modest estate in Tula province, acquired after ennoblement in 1828 through civil service reforms that blurred rigid class boundaries like ink on wet parchment, where roamed the fields and woods, forging bonds with the serfs whose simple kindnesses, like the peasant's compassionate gesture during a childhood fright involving a imagined wolf, imprinted upon him a belief in innate human goodness buried beneath societal cruelties, a hidden truth perhaps echoing ancient pagan myths of earthbound guardians that predated Christian Russia. But this idyllic interlude shattered with tragedy when, in 1837, at the age of 15, his beloved mother succumbed to tuberculosis, her lingering illness casting a pall over the household, leaving his authoritarian temperament unchecked, a sternness that bordered on tyranny, enforcing rigid discipline and isolating the children from peers, prompting whispers among biographers of psychological scars that may have fueled later depictions of paternal oppression. And in a darker twist, his own demise in 1839, officially an apoplectic stroke, but persistently to be murder by his embittered serfs on the estate, avenging years of alleged cruelty, including beatings and exploitation, plunged the family into orphanhood, the event shrouded in mystery, with some accounts suggesting suppressed evidence of a peasant conspiracy akin to the ancient revolts of, where bondsmen rose against their overlords in blood-soaked bids for justice, an incident that Freudian analysts later linked to epileptic seizures as manifestations of repressed guilt or trauma, though the truth remains veiled in the mists of rural folklore, leaving and his siblings to navigate a precarious future. With the brothers and dispatched to boarding schools in Moscow before enrollment in 1838 at the Military Engineering Institute in St. Petersburg, the glittering imperial capital of palaces and intrigue, where he endured the regimented drudgery of mathematics, fortifications, and military drills, earning the nickname Monk Photius for his reclusive, bookish demeanor amid the academy's rowdy cadets. His mind drifting to literary pursuits as he devoured satirical tales and Gothic fantasies in secret, graduating in 1843 as a sub-lieutenant, but resigning his commission the following year to pursue writing full-time, a defiant gamble that echoed the heroic rebellions in the epics he cherished, translating for scant while grappling with mounting debts. His debut novel Poor Folk in 1846 exploding onto the literary scene as an epistolary masterpiece, depicting the poignant struggles of impoverished clerks in St. Petersburg's underbelly, lauded by critic as a triumph of social realism that thrust into the salons of the intelligentsia, where utopian ideas fermented like forbidden brews, yet acclaim waned with the double in 1846. A hallucinatory exploration of identity and madness that critics dismissed as overly fantastical, and subsequent stories like Mr. and the Landlady in 1847 met similar indifference, his psychological innovations perhaps subtly inspired by uncharted encounters with Gnostic manuscripts in clandestine libraries, ancient texts positing the soul as a divine spark ensnared in corporeal duality, adding esoteric depth to his narratives that contemporaries overlooked. Amid this creative flux, his entanglement with the Circle from 1847, a gathering of progressive thinkers debating Fourier's socialist utopias, the emancipation of serfs, and censored Western philosophies, escalated when he joined a radical splinter group led by, reciting atheist tracts like Letter to, drawing the vigilant gaze of Tsar Nicholas I's third section, Secret Police, culminating in his arrest on April 23, 1849, in the pre-dawn hush, confined for 8 months in the grim Peter and Fortress, where solitary cells echoed with the ghosts of past dissidents, a trial of isolation that mirrored the ascetic ordeals of desert fathers in early Christian law, leading to the infamous mock execution on December 22, 1849, at Square, Ware and his comrades, hooded and bound before a firing squad amid swirling snow, heard the drums roll and rifles cock, only for a theatrical reprieve from the Tsar commuting death to 4 years of hard in Siberia. A psychological rupture that reborn him, revealing suffering as a divine forge for the spirit, perhaps resonating with forgotten Stoic doctrines from smuggled Roman codices, as he was shackled and exiled in January 1850 to the Omsk fortress prison, enduring 4 years of grueling toil in fetid barracks among hardened criminals, murderers, thieves, and political exiles, where vermin swarmed and chains chafed. His only comfort, a concealed New Testament that illuminated parables of forgiveness amid brutality. Interactions with inmates like the noble Pole or the Tartar convict, revealing glimmers of humanity in the abyss. Stories that would vivify his 1861-62 memoir The House of the Dead, a searing indictment of the penal system that humanized the condemned, while epilepsy, first manifesting around 1846, but intensifying in exile with ecstatic auras he likened to heavenly visions, afflicted him like prophetic seizures, medical enigmas possibly tied to inherited vulnerabilities or the psychic wounds of his father's shadowy fate. Released in 1854 to compulsory military service as a private in Semipalatinsk, a remote Kazakh outpost where steppe winds carried echoes of nomadic legends from the Golden Horde. Befriended figures like Baron Alexander, an ethnographer, whose insights into Central Asian folklore enriched his cultural tapestry, kindling a romance with Maria, the consumptive wife of a customs official, whom he married in 1857 after her husband's death in a union passionate yet turbulent. By her declining health, his jealous rages, and financial strains, their time in a fleeting haven before permission to return to European Russia in 1859. Settling first in Tver, then St. Petersburg, where poverty's vice tightened amid gambling addictions that ignited during 1862 European travels, losing fortunes at roulette in Wiesbaden and Baden-Baden, pursuits that symbolized fate's cruel whims, perhaps drawing from ancient Persian gambling myths where dice represented cosmic chance, grieving Maria's death from tuberculosis in 1864, and brother sudden passing that year from liver disease. Inheriting crippling debts and familial obligations that forced frantic writing to stave off ruin, co-founding the journal's Time in 1861 and Epoch in 1864 to advocate a return to the soil, ideology merging Slavophil reverence for Russian orthodoxy with calls for reconciliation between classes, critiquing Western materialism in Winter Notes on Summer Impressions in 1863. While Notes from Underground in 1864 pioneered existential rebellion through its spiteful narrator, decrying deterministic rationalism, heralding modern antiheroes, followed by the epochal Crime and Punishment in 1866, serialized amid desperation, tracing student axe murder of a pawnbroker and his anguished path to redemption via suffering and love in themes echoing ancient Hebraic concepts of sacrificial atonement from Talmudic shadows. Dictated the Gambler in 1866 in a 26-day frenzy to meet contractual deadlines, employing young stenographer Anna, whose efficiency blossomed into love, marrying her in 1867 despite a 25-year age gap, a partnership that brought order to his chaos as they evaded creditors in Europe from 1867-1871, enduring heartbreaks like infant daughter's death in 1868 from pneumonia in Geneva, yet welcoming in 1869 in Dresden, in 1871 in Baden-Baden, and in 1875 back in Russia, the latter's tragic epileptic death at age 3 in 1878, deepening meditations on innocent suffering as a riddle of faith, akin to Job's trials in biblical antiquity, crafting the Idiot in 1868-69 amid Swiss exile, depicting Prince's epileptic innocence as a Christ figure colliding with worldly corruption. Inspired by stark dead Christ painting and perhaps obscured Byzantine icons of suffering, then The Eternal Husband in 1870, probing cuckoldry's humiliations, and Demons in 1871-72, a prophetic satire on revolutionary nihilism drawn from the real murder case, portraying ideology as demonic infestation, resonant with Manichaean dualisms from Persian heresies long suppressed. Returning to St. Petersburg in 1871, with debts mounting and health faltering from emphysema rooted in Siberian hardships, yet producing The Adolescent in 1875, a coming-of-age saga of ideological turmoil, and A Writer's Diary from 1873-881, monthly columns dissecting current events, prophetic dreams, and moral quandaries with a pan-Slavic zeal that intensified during the 1877-78 Turkish War. Championing Orthodox liberation of Balkan Slavs from Ottoman yoke, a crescendo in his public stature with the June 1880 speech at the Poets' Monument, unveiling in Moscow, a masterful oration hailing Russian literature's universal humanism and the people's messianic role, bridging liberal and conservative divides in a triumphant apex, yet physical decline accelerated with pulmonary, possibly exacerbated by a heated family dispute over inheritance or the arrest of a neighboring terrorist, leading to his final illness, dying on February 9, 1881, or January 28 Old Style, at age 59 in his St. Petersburg apartment, his last words invoking's parable of the grain dying to bear fruit, buried at cemetery in a funeral procession of 30,000 mourners from all strata, his legacy an indelible imprint on global thought. Inspiring existentialists like who grappled with his will to power, inversions, psychoanalysts like analyzing his parasitical motifs in the Brothers, and novelists from absurd trials to Southern Gothic torments, his works translated into over 170 languages, commemorated in museums like the house in St. Petersburg, stamps, asteroids named in his, and ongoing scholarly debates over his ambivalent stances on Judaism, feminism, and socialism. Veiled complexities that invite perpetual rediscovery, while his philosophy, positing suffering as the crucible for moral and spiritual rebirth, faith as a leap amid rational doubt, and morality as the heart's battleground between God and the devil, resonates with American ideals of resilience and self-reinvention, linking back to hidden antiquities like Platonic dialogues on the soul's immortality or Essene scrolls of apocalyptic redemption, weaving a narrative that endures as a testament to the human spirit's unyielding quest through darkness toward transcendent light, a saga that unfolds eternally in the minds of readers across epochs. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the enigmatic whispers of Byzantine mystics blended with the nomadic echoes of Tartar warlords from the Golden Horde, a man named traversed a life riddled with the profound mysteries of human suffering and redemption. His existence, an intricate mosaic, unveiling forgotten truths from antiquity, truths perhaps carved in the cryptic runes of Scythian shamans or the veiled parables of early Christian ascetics, concealed in monastic crypts, drawing us into the depths of a soul tempered by adversity, where anguish transformed into illuminating wisdom on faith, morality, and the eternal dance between good and evil, as we immerse ourselves in this captivating saga, beginning with his birth on November 11, 1821, or October 30, by the old-style Julian calendar, in the vibrant yet gritty heart of Moscow, a city where the ornate golden domes of Orthodox cathedrals pierced the hazy skies like relics from a medieval epoch, emerged as the second child among seven in a family of modest nobility. His father, a disciplined military surgeon of Lithuanian-Polish descent, who had risen from clerical origins to serve at the hospital for the poor, a sprawling complex on the city's outskirts where the air hung heavy with the sense of illness and desperation, and his mother Maria, a gentle soul from a devout merchant lineage, whose warmth illuminated their cramped apartment within the hospital grounds, an unconventional home that exposed Young to the raw tapestry of human misery as he roamed the wards and gardens, mingling with beggars, alcoholics, and the terminally ill whose weathered faces and hushed laments sowed the seeds of his lifelong empathy for the downtrodden. But beneath this surface lay deeper enigmas, for the family's paternal ancestry traced back to a Tatar defector from the Golden Horde in 1389, who converted to Orthodox Christianity under Grand Prince, infusing his bloodline with the restless spirit of steppe nomads, whose ancient myths of eternal wanderings and spiritual trials might have subtly echoed in his explorations of the soul's nomadic quest for meaning. Overlooked threads connecting him to the forgotten shamans of Central Asia who divined fate through bone oracles and star patterns, while his siblings, older brother who perished in infancy, sister, brothers, and who grappled with alcoholism's shadows, sister, and others lost young, formed a close-knit circle in their hospital enclave, ennobled in 1828 when attained the rank of collegiate assessor, granting them a small estate in, some 150 from Moscow, where summers unfolded amid rolling fields and dense woods, a rural idyll that contrasted the urban squalor, yet even here mysteries lurked. His early imagination was kindled by his nanny, a masterful storyteller who regaled him from age 3 with heroic sagas, fairy tales, and Slavic legends of forest spirits and wandering souls battling moral tempests, tales that perhaps drew from pre-Christian folklore hidden in peasant oral traditions, evoking ancient pagan deities like the thunder god whose wrath mirrored the internal storms in his later characters. And at 4 years old, his mother taught him to read using the Bible, embedding verses from the book of Job that would resonate through his philosophy of suffering as a divine test, while family evenings brimmed with readings from Russian luminaries like historical epics, Alexander's poetic romances, odes, alongside Gothic thrills from romantic depths from Schiller and heroic quests by N. Scott, Homer's timeless Iliad and Odyssey, and the satirical bite of whose grotesque realism profoundly shaped style, but childhood bore darker imprints, such as witnessing at 9 the traumatic rape of a young girl by a drunkard, a haunting event that seeped into his novel's themes of predatory desire toward innocence in works like Demons, The Brothers, and Crime and Punishment, and a pivotal moment in when, terrified by an imagined wolf's cry, he was comforted by the surf, an act of unbidden kindness that later crystallized in his essay, The Peasant, as evidence of innate human goodness buried under societal oppression. A revelation perhaps echoing ancient Slavic myths of guardian earth spirits protecting the vulnerable, while physical delicacy marked him as hot-headed, stubborn, and cheeky, leading to enrollment in 1833 at a French boarding school, and then the boarding school where he felt alienated among aristocratic peers, an isolation mirrored in the adolescent's portrayals of youthful estrangement, yet religious foundations deepened through Sunday liturgies, pilgrimages to the Trinity of, and biblical immersions that fortified his orthodox faith against future doubts, until tragedy struck in 1837 with his mother's death from tuberculosis at age 15, unraveling the family's warmth and exposing harsh authoritarianism, a sternness that isolated the children and sowed seeds of paternal resentment, culminating in its mysterious demise on June 16, 1839. Officially an apoplectic stroke, but persistently as murder by enraged serfs on the estate, avenging alleged cruelties like beatings and exploitation, a conspiracy akin to the rebellion's ancient uprisings where bondsmen wielded bloody justice against tyrants, an event shrouded in controversy, with neighbor accusations dismissed in court but perpetuated by family law, which later as fueling epileptic seizures through repressed patricidal guilt. Though the truth remains veiled in rural whispers and suppressed records, leaving orphaned and adrift with his siblings, thrust into military education as he and brother journeyed to St. Petersburg in May 1837, enrolling in January 1838 at the Military Engineering Institute, a bastion of discipline where chafed against the rigors of mathematics, fortifications, and drills, preferring drawing and architecture. An outsider among 120 cadets who mocked his reclusiveness and piety, earning him the sobriquet monk Photius, after the Byzantine patriarch, whose theological debates on faith versus reason might have subliminally influenced philosophical dualities. While early epilepsy hints emerged around age 17 amid his father's death, and leisure escapes involved visits to now Tallinn, cultural outings to plays and operas, and initial forays into gambling's allure. Graduating in 1843 as a lieutenant engineer, but resigning in 1844 to embrace literature's call, a rebellious pivot echoing the heroic defiances in Don, translatings for meager earnings while debts mounted. His debut Poor Folk completed in May 1845 and published January 15, 1846, in the Petersburg Collection Almanac, an epistolary triumph hailed by as Russia's inaugural social novel, depicting the soul-crushing poverty of urban clerks, catapulting into intellectual salons where utopian ideals simmered, yet acclaim with the double published January 30, 1846, in Notes of the Fatherland, its psychological delving into madness and identity critiqued as overly bizarre, compounded by health declines with frequent seizures and growing disapproval. Finding solace in the circle's utopian socialism and friendships with poets like and Valerian, while short stories like Mr. The Landlady, A Weak Heart, and White Nights emerged between 1846 and 1848, and the unfinished serialized in 1849, halted by fate. His early exposure to socialist thinkers like Charles Fourier, Pierre Joseph, and Saint clashing with his orthodox roots against atheism, leading to immersion in the circle from 1846 via debating censorship abolition and serf emancipation, escalating to a secret revolutionary splinter under despite inner reservations, a path that invited peril as Tsar Nicholas I's third section spied on dissent, culminating in his arrest on April 23, 1849, in the night's silence, interrogated by a commission including the Tsar himself, sentenced to death, and subjected to the infamous mock execution on December 22, 1849, at Square amid swirling snow. Hooded and bound as the third in line for the firing squad, drums thundering and rifles poised, only for a dramatic commutation to 4 years of hard in Siberia, an ordeal etched in the idiot through Prince recounting, a psychological rebirth unveiling suffering's redemptive power, perhaps resonating with ancient Stoic endurance from Epictetus, enslaved wisdom or Gnostic texts positing trials as liberation from material chains, exiled in January 1850 to the Omsk fortress, enduring 4 years of shackled toil in fetid barracks swarming with fleas, lice, and vermin on rotten floors, classified as a dangerous criminal among murderers and thieves, despised by Polish inmates for his Russian nationalism, yet respected by some like Ivan whom he consoled, his sole comfort a smuggled New Testament that illuminated parables of forgiveness amid brutality, health ravaged by fevers and weight loss, emerging in February 1854, transformed. Requesting philosophical tomes by and cant to probe history cycles, then serving compulsory military duty in Semipalatinsk. Now, until 1859, befriending intellectuals like and Kazakh ethnographer whose steppe law echoed his Tatar heritage, kindling a torrid affair with Maria, a customs official's consumptive wife, marrying her February 7, 1857, in despite her rejections over his poverty, a union passionate yet fraught with her suspicions. His jealous rages and separations, unhappy as it mirrored the tormented bonds in his tailies, returning to Tver then St. Petersburg in 1859, publishing The House of the Dead in 1861-62, a groundbreaking memoir exposing prison's dehumanizing yet humanizing facets, alongside short stories like A Little Hero composed in prison, Uncle's Dream, and The Village of in 1860, Humiliated and Insulted in 1861. Founding magazine with Brothers backing to propagate a return to the soil ideology blending with orthodox unity against Western rationalism. while 1862 European travels to Cologne, Berlin, Paris, and London critiqued capitalism's soullessness in winter notes on summer impressions, meeting in 1863 amid gambling sprees in Wiesbaden and Baden-Baden, where fortunes evaporated, pawning possessions in desperation. Addictions perhaps rooted in ancient Persian dice games, symbolizing cosmic uncertainty, grieving Maria's tuberculosis death in 1864, and liver failure that year, inheriting debts and stepson Pasha's care as Epoch magazine folded. Yet from ashes rose masterpieces like Notes from Underground in 1864, a proto-existential novella railing against deterministic egoism through its spiteful narrator. Serialized Crime and Punishment in 1866 in The Russian Messenger, chronicling Axe murder, guilt's torment, and redemption via suffering and love, themes echoing Hebraic atonement from Talmudic depths, dictating the gambler in a 26-day frenzy to meet deadlines. Stenographer Anna, whose devotion led to marriage February 15, 1867, in Trinity Cathedral despite a 25-year age gap. A stabilizing bond as they fled creditors to Europe in a 4-year honeymoon from 1867-1871, quarreling with Ivan, gambling in Baden-Baden, even pawning underwear, birthing daughter March 5, 1868, in Geneva only to lose her to pneumonia 3 months later in profound grief, continuing in Milan. Florence, where the idiot serialized 1868-69 depicted Prince's epileptic innocence as a Christ-like figure clashing with societal egoism, inspired by Hans' Dead Christ, and perhaps Byzantine hagiographies of saints enduring worldly scorn. Daughter born September 26, 1869, in Dresden, beginning demons after the 1869 murder, a satirical inferno on nihilistic chaos via resonant with Manichaean dualisms from suppressed Persian heresies, debating his gambling cessation after birth or a mystical sign, mistaking a synagogue for a casino, returning to St. Petersburg July 1871 amid financial woes, selling possessions, son born July 16, 1871, reviving ties with conservatives like Vladimir, and summering in for mineral spas, grieving Anna's sister's death from typhus or malaria. Finishing Demons November 26, 1872, published 1873 via their own company with Anna managing sales from their apartment, launching a writer's diary in 1873 for the Citizen at 3,000 yearly, essays dissecting society, religion, and prophetic dreams, leaving in 1874 due to stress and lawsuits, health faltering with catarrh treated in Bad Ems, son born August 10, 1875, in serializing The Adolescent in 1875 on youthful legitimacy and father-son rifts, compiling diary into an 1876 book that sold well, a dacha in enduring shortness of breath, and a third Ems visit in 1876 advising climate change, invited by Tsar Alexander II to educate princes, and suffering 4 seizures in March 1877, visiting and nostalgic, attending's funeral with a stirring speech. Elected to the Russian Academy in 1879, tragic loss of son to epilepsy May 16, 1879, at age 3, a heartbreak echoing Job's innocent sufferings, 4th Ems trip diagnosing pulmonary emphysema, ascending to Slavic Benevolent Society leadership in 1880, delivering the iconic speech June 8, 1880, in Moscow at the Poets' Monument, unveiling an emotional paean to Russian humanism's universality that bridged ideological divides. Applauded wildly yet critiqued by Alexander, and for idealizing the peasantry, health spiraling with pulmonary, possibly triggered by a family quarrel over aunt's estate, or the February 6, 1881. Police search of neighbor Alexander for ties ahead of the Tsar's assassination. Suffering bleeds the next day despite denials of connection. Requesting the prodigal son parable for his children, quoting 3:14:15 in his final breaths, whispering to Anna, "Remember, I have always loved you passionately, and have never been unfaithful to you ever, even in my thoughts, passing on February 9, 1881, or January 28 Old Style. At age 59 in his St. Petersburg apartment, his body laid on a table per custom, buried at cemetery in Alexander near, and with 40,000 to 100,000 mourners from all walks, his tombstone inscribed with John 12:24 on the grain dying to bear fruit. A legacy as Russia's paramount novelist, influencing moral realism, Anton's humanism, Albert Camus and Jean's existentialism, psychoanalysis of parasite motifs, who deemed him the only psychologist from whom I have learned something, translated into over 170 languages, inspiring films, museums like the 1971 house in St. Petersburg, Soviet stamps in 1956, lunar craters and asteroids named in metro stations, and 2021 bicentennial celebrations in Kazakhstan. Yet criticisms abound from for excessive psychology, Vladimir for chaotic plots, Ivan for stylistic flaws, while praised his polyphonic voices, his philosophy critiquing Western rationalism, defending orthodox faith against atheism and socialism, free will's chaos, suffering's crucible for morality, and Panslavism's call for unity, ideas tied to historical contexts like the 1860s reforms, nihilist surges, and Polish revolts, with lesser-known facets like premarital romances with and anti-Polish sentiments from prison, ambivalent views on Judaism defending their vitality in letters, posthumous notebooks like Confession translated by Virginia Woolf in 1922, and enduring mysteries around epilepsy's onset, gambling's true end, and the triggers, all weaving a narrative that links ancient antiquities, Platonic souls, Essene apocalypses, Tartar shamanic quests, to the timeless human drama, inviting perpetual rediscovery in the quiet hours of contemplation. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the faint echoes of Byzantine mystics intertwined with the restless spirits of Tartar nomads from the ancient Golden Horde, a man named charted a course through the labyrinths of the human soul, his life an unbroken thread weaving forgotten truths from antiquity. Perhaps the dualistic visions of Gnostic sects hidden in desert scrolls, or the ascetic trials of early Orthodox hermits buried in monastic silence, into a profound meditation on suffering, faith, free will, and the redemptive power of moral struggle, inviting us to linger in the quiet contemplation of a destiny shaped by genius, torment, and enigmatic revelations. As we continue this immersive exploration, beginning with his birth on November 11, 1821, in Moscow's Hospital for the Poor, where his father, a stern military surgeon of disputed noble lineage tracing back through centuries to a Tartar prince who defected from the horde in 1389, converted to Christianity, and allied with Grand Prince, perhaps carrying in his blood the nomadic hunger for spiritual horizons that would later manifest in relentless probing of existential boundaries, while his mother Maria, from a pious merchant family, offered a counterpoint of tender religiosity, teaching her children scripture from infancy and filling their modest quarters with the resonant cadences of the Psalms and the lives of the saints, an upbringing steeped in orthodox ritual that contrasted sharply with the hospital's grim daily parade of poverty and affliction, where young, sensitive, and observant absorbed the cries of the dying and the quiet dignity of the broken, experiences that seeded his novel's unflinching portrayals of human degradation and unexpected grace. Yet even these early impressions carried layers of mystery, for the hospital grounds rested on ancient Moscow soil to hold remnants of medieval catacombs where fugitive believers had etched prayers for deliverance through trial, subtle influences that might have attuned the boy's mind to the idea of suffering as a pathway to transcendence. Summers spent at the family's small estate in providing fleeting escapes into rural simplicity, where he roamed forests alive with Slavic folklore. Tales of house spirits and forest guardians whispered by serfs, forming a bond with the peasant whose gentle reassurance during a childhood panic over a phantom wolf cry became In later recollection, a symbol of Christ's hidden presence in the humble and oppressed, a memory that illuminated his belief in the redemptive potential within every soul. But darkness encroached when, at 15, tuberculosis claimed his mother in 1837. Her slow decline leaving scars of grief that deepened under his father's increasingly tyrannical rule. A man whose severity toward his serfs bred resentment, culminating in his mysterious death on June 8, 1839, officially recorded as an apoplectic stroke, but persistently shadowed by of murder by enraged peasants on the estate, perhaps in brutal retribution for alleged cruelties, including beatings, exploitation, and darker improprieties with village women. Accounts varying from strangulation to a gruesome crushing of his genitals, followed by forced drowning in vodka. Tales suppressed by family and authorities, alike to avoid scandal or loss of land, yet circulating in hushed village lore and later analyzed by as the trigger for epilepsy through repressed Oedipal guilt over patricidal fantasies, though modern scholars lean toward organic causes, possibly inherited neurological vulnerability exacerbated by trauma, leaving the truth veiled in ambiguity that fueled lifelong fascination with parasite, conscience, and the psyche's hidden depths. As seen in the brothers, orphaned and burdened, entered the Military Engineering Institute in St. Petersburg in 1838, enduring mechanical drills and mathematical precision, while his spirit fled to literature, Schiller, earning the mocking nickname Monk Photius for his pious withdrawal amid cadet carousing. His first epileptic episodes possibly emerging around his father's death, characterized by ecstatic auras he described as moments of infinite harmony and divine insight, before convulsive darkness, seizures that medical historians now classify as likely temporal lobe epilepsy with complex partial onset and secondary generalization, often nocturnal, inflicting physical injuries and postictal confusion, yet granting him profound, almost mystical perceptions that informed Prince's visions in The Idiot, graduating in 1843, but resigning swiftly to chase literary dreams, translating while poverty gnawed. His breakthrough Poor Folk in 1846 earning acclaim as a compassionate chronicler of the insulted and injured, drawing him into radical circles where Fourierist utopias clashed with orthodox mysticism, his involvement with the circle escalating to secret readings of forbidden texts, leading to arrest on April 23, 1849, 8 months in Peter and Fortress's solitary cells, mirroring ancient monastic ordeals of isolation and illumination, then the mock execution on December 22, hooded, bound, rifles raised in swirling snow, only for reprieve at the last instant, commuting death to Siberian, a near death that shattered illusions and reborn faith, as he later wrote of glimpsing eternity in that suspended moment. Chained to Omsk prison from 1850 to 1854, among convicts whose stories of crime and redemption humanized evil in the house of the dead, his New Testament a lifeline amid vermin and brutality, epilepsy worsening yet yielding ecstatic glimpses he cherished as foretastes of paradise, released to Semipalatinsk military service until 1859, marrying Maria in 1857. A passionate but tormented union shadowed by her consumption and his jealousies, returning to Petersburg amid debts and burgeoning gambling addiction that erupted in European casinos from 1862, roulette's hypnotic wheel devouring fortunes in Wiesbaden and Baden-Baden, and compulsion perhaps echoing ancient Persian dice rituals of fate's caprice, yet channeling desperation into genius. Notes from Underground in 1864's defiant antihero raging against rational utopias, Crime and Punishment in 1866's wrestling redemption through axe-murder guilt and sacrificial love. The gambler dictated in frenzy to stenographer Anna, whom he married in 1867, her steadfastness anchoring their fugitive European years marked by infant losses, to pneumonia in 1868, and births amid exile. The idiot's Christ-like prince clashing with corrupt society, Demon's prophetic satire on revolutionary demons inspired by surreal murder, the adolescent's youthful turmoil, and the brothers in 1880, his magnum opus dissecting faith, doubt, and patricide through Ivan's Grand Inquisitor legend questioning divine justice in a suffering world. Ideas resonant with suppressed Byzantine debates on theodicy and Manichaean dualisms of light versus darkness. His philosophy crystallizing suffering not as meaningless, but as crucible for moral awakening. Faith as defiant choice amid absurdity, morality as lived interior battle, pan-Slavic visions of Russia's messianic role, peaking in the 1880 speech's ecstatic celebration of universal brotherhood. Yet health crumbled. Emphysema from Siberian cold, possibly hastened by estate quarrels or revolutionary shadows. Dying February 9, 1881, at 59. Quoting scripture on the grain dying to bear fruit, mourned by thousands, his legacy vast. Existentialism's precursor influencing Camus, psychoanalysis via parasite lens. Polyphonic narrative revolutionizing fiction, translated globally, museums him, yet mysteries persist. Epilepsy's exact origins, gambling's grip, anti-Semitic nuances in letters, affairs, threads linking ancient Gnostic soul struggles, Stoic endurance, orthodox to modern quests for meaning. A life that whispers in quiet nights of the soul's capacity to rise through abyss toward light, enduring as invitation to ponder our own hidden depths. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the lingering resonances of Byzantine liturgical chants merged with the distant thunder of Tartar horsemen from the long-fallen Golden Horde, a man named walked a path etched by both visible torment and invisible revelations. His existence, a slow unveiling of truths that seem to reach back through centuries, perhaps to the dualistic cosmologies of ancient Gnostic sects that viewed the material world as a flawed prison for the divine spark, or to the practices of orthodox mystics who sought unceasing prayer of the heart mid silent wildernesses, influences that subtly permeated his thought, even if he never explicitly named them, as his novels grappled with the soul's entrapment in flesh and its yearning for transcendent freedom, drawing us deeper into a narrative where personal agony became the forge for philosophical and spiritual insight, as we extend this meditative journey through his life. Beginning anew with the enigmatic circumstances surrounding his paternal lineage. For while family tradition traced the name to a Tartar noble who defected from the Golden Horde in 1389, converted to orthodoxy under Grand Prince, and whose descendants acquired lands in the region before adopting the surname from the village of in what is now Belarus. This ancestry carried whispers of nomadic restlessness and cultural fusion that may have unconsciously shaped fascination with the outsider, the wanderer, the soul adrift between worlds, a theme recurring in characters like the underground man or who reject societal norms in pursuit of radical self-assertion. Yet historical scrutiny reveals this Tartar link as a romanticized family legend, more folklore than verifiable genealogy. With no direct documentary proof beyond 16th century noble grants, leaving it as one of those half-hidden threads that add mythic depth to his identity, much like the murder of his father in 1839 at the estate, where official records cited an apoplectic stroke, but persistent village accounts spoke of serf vengeance. Perhaps a brutal assault involving crushing of the genitals followed by forced drowning in vodka, for years of alleged cruelty, beatings, exploitation, and even improprieties with peasant women, stories that family members suppressed to preserve reputation and inheritance, avoiding scandal in a society where noble hung by fragile threads, an event that later interpreted as the psychic origin of epilepsy through repressed guilt over patricidal wishes. Though contemporary medical views temporal lobe epilepsy with complex partial seizures, possibly inherited or triggered by trauma, rather than purely psychogenic causes. The ambiguity itself mirroring the moral grey zones so masterfully explored in his fiction, where motives remain forever veiled and elusive, his epilepsy itself a profound and less appreciated force in his creative life, manifesting often as nocturnal generalized tonic-clonic seizures preceded by an ecstatic aura, a rare phenomenon now termed epilepsy or ecstatic seizures, where for mere seconds he experienced overwhelming bliss, serenity, heightened self-awareness, time dilation, and an indescribable harmony that he described in The Idiot through Prince as worth an entire lifetime, a moment of unbounded joy and rapture, ecstatic devotion, and completest life. Sensations modern neurology localizes to activation in the dorsal anterior insula, a brain region integrating sensory, autonomic, affective, and cognitive functions into self-consciousness, leading some researchers to view these auras not as mere pathology, but as glimpses into altered states that blurred the line between neurological event and mystical experience, profoundly influencing his depictions of spiritual ecstasy, divine insight amid suffering, and the thin boundary between madness and revelation, auras that occurred perhaps dozens of times yearly in his later life, leaving him physically exhausted yet spiritually enriched. As he confided to friends that these fleeting paradises made the subsequent convulsions bearable, weaving epilepsy into the fabric of his philosophy, where suffering and transcendence coexist inseparably. His gambling addiction, another shadowed compulsion that gripped him from the early 1860s during European sojourns, particularly roulette in Wiesbaden and Baden-Baden, where he would lose entire advances from publishers. Pawn clothing and possessions, including Anna's wedding ring and dresses, driven by a feverish hope that one more spin could reverse fortune, only to collapse into self-loathing and moral degradation afterward, a cycle he dissected in The Gambler with painful self-recognition. Yet this vice also served as desperate fuel for his art, forcing him to dictate novels under crushing deadlines to pay debts, transforming personal ruin into literary masterpieces that probe the irrational depths of human will, free choice, and the allure of chaos over rational order, addictions and illnesses that compounded with familial tragedies. Maria's lingering tuberculosis death in 1864, brother, sudden passing the same year leaving debts and dependents, infant daughter's loss to pneumonia in Geneva Exile, and son's epileptic death at 3 in 1878. A blow that echoed his own affliction and deepened meditations on innocent suffering as the ultimate challenge to faith, as in Ivan's rebellion against a world where children suffer. Yet these losses paradoxically strengthened his conviction that true Christianity demands embracing the absurd and the painful as paths to resurrection. His lesser-known works offering further windows into these obsessions, from the grotesque psychological fantasy of the double identity's fragmentation, to obscure short stories like Mr. with its miserly paranoia, a weak heart's tragic romanticism, and the unfinished delving into childhood trauma and artistic awakening, pieces often overshadowed by the major novels, but rich in early experiments with unreliable narration, dream states, and the grotesque that foreshadow his mature polyphony, influences subtly drawn not only from, and but perhaps from broader undercurrents, Byzantine's emphasis on inner stillness and uncreated light, or even echoes of Gnostic dualism in the tension between corrupt matter and imprisoned spirit, though remained firmly within orthodox bounds, critiquing rationalism and socialism while affirming Christ's realism, where divinity enters the mess of human existence, his final years marked by public acclaim. The 1880 speech uniting factions in Moscow with its vision of Russia's universal humanistic mission, yet shadowed by emphysema and quiet domestic strains, dying on February 9, 1881, after a final pulmonary crisis, possibly exacerbated by emotional turmoil over family inheritance or nearby revolutionary arrests. His last words drawing from his parable of the grain that must die to bear fruit, a fitting emblem for a life where personal destruction yielded eternal literary and philosophical harvest, a legacy that continues to resonate across cultures, inviting readers to confront their own hidden abysses and glimmers of grace. Pondering how ancient mysteries of the soul, ecstatic visions, moral dualities, redemptive suffering, manifest anew in one man's tormented yet luminous journey. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the solemn chants of Byzantine liturgy echoed, faintly alongside the wild steppe winds, carrying tales from the ancient golden horde, lived a life that seemed to bridge the visible world of suffering and the hidden realms of spiritual mystery, his existence gradually revealing truths that stretched back through forgotten epochs, perhaps to the ecstatic visions of early Christian mystics practicing in silent prayer, seeking the uncreated light of God within the heart, or even to the dualistic struggles of Gnostic sects who saw the material realm as a flawed prison from which the divine spark yearns to escape. Ideas that, while never directly claimed by, subtly resonate in his portrayals of the soul's torment and its glimpses of transcendent harmony. As we linger longer in this contemplative unfolding of his story, returning once more to the enigmatic roots of his family lineage. For though family lore proudly traced the name to a Tartar noble from the Golden Horde who in 1389 defected to Muscovite service under Grand Prince, converted to Orthodoxy, and whose descendants eventually settled in lands that gave rise to the surname from the village of in what is now Belarus, this connection remains more cherished tradition than ironclad historical fact. With no definitive medieval documents confirming the direct link beyond noble grants and oral genealogies that romanticized the Tartar infusion of nomadic resilience and cultural blending into the bloodline, a mythic thread that nonetheless enriched sense of the outsider soul, the wanderer caught between worlds, much like the restless protagonists who populate his pages, rejecting easy belonging in of radical inner quests. Yet this ancestral whisper of steppe heritage, perhaps unconsciously his depictions of cultural fusion, moral ambiguity, and the search for spiritual authenticity amid chaos, just as the official nobility status granted to his father in 1828, through civil service as a collegiate assessor, allowed the purchase of the modest estate, a place of formative summers where young absorbed peasant kindnesses and rural folklore, yet also where tragedy struck with his father's mysterious death in June 1839, officially listed as an apoplectic stroke, but surrounded by persistent of murder at the hands of enraged serfs, accounts varying from brutal assault, some claiming the assailants crushed his genitals before drowning him in vodka forced down his throat, to simpler retribution for habitual cruelty, beatings, exploitation, and alleged improprieties with village women. Stories that neighbor used to accuse the serfs in hopes of the land, though investigations dismissed the claims amid bribery whispers or lack of evidence, leaving the truth shrouded in rural secrecy and family suppression to protect inheritance and reputation, an ambiguity that later seized upon in his 1928 essay, and Parasite, to argue the event fueled repressed guilt manifesting as epilepsy. A psychogenic interpretation now largely supplanted by views of temporal lobe epilepsy with complex partial seizures, possibly inherited or trauma-exacerbated, yet the shadow of patricide lingered, surfacing powerfully in the brothers, where parricidal impulses and moral reckoning dominate the narrative, his epilepsy emerging as one of the most profound yet underappreciated forces shaping his inner world, with seizures often beginning in nocturnal patterns and rare ecstatic auras, intense, fleeting moments of unbounded joy, rapture, harmony, time dilation, and divine insight that he described as worth an entire lifetime. Sensations modern neurology attributes to activation in the dorsal anterior insula, a region integrating self-awareness, emotion, and bodily states, leading some to classify his condition as epilepsy, where ecstatic experiences arise as genuine epileptic phenomena rather than mere literary invention. Auras that granted him glimpses of completest life and ecstatic devotion, before convulsive darkness descended, leaving him exhausted yet spiritually elevated. As he confided, these seconds of paradise made the subsequent agony tolerable, profoundly influencing depictions like Prince's transcendent moments in The Idiot, where epilepsy blurs the boundary between pathology and mysticism, turning personal affliction into a lens for faith's irrational leaps amid doubt. The ecstatic aura, perhaps echoing traditions of inner stillness and divine light, sought through repetitive prayer of the heart, a Byzantine practice that emphasized experiential union with God beyond rational discourse. Resonances might have absorbed indirectly through orthodox piety and monastic influences rather than direct study. His lesser-known works offering quieter glimpses into these obsessions, such as The Unfinished with its haunting exploration of childhood trauma, artistic awakening, and Fractured Identity, or the grotesque Mr. delving into paranoid miserliness and psychological isolation, stories that experiment with unreliable narration, dreamlike states, and the grotesque in ways foreshadowing his mature polyphony. Influences drawn not only from, but potentially from deeper undercurrents of Eastern Christian mysticism, where the material world's corruptions contrast with the soul's imprisoned light. Themes that align loosely with Gnostic dualisms, though anchored firmly in orthodoxy. Insisting Christ's entry into human mess offers the only true redemption against rationalist utopias and socialist abstractions. His gambling compulsion, erupting fiercely in the 1860s during European wanderings saw him squander publisher advances at roulette tables in Wiesbaden and Baden-Baden, pawning even Anna's possessions in desperate cycles of hope and ruin that mirrored the existential wagers in his fiction. A vice that forced frantic creativity under deadlines, yet also symbolized the irrational pull of chaos over ordered reason. Addictions compounded by familial heartbreaks. The slow tuberculosis death of first wife Maria in 1864, brothers passing the same year burdening him with debts and dependence, infants lost to pneumonia in Swiss exile, and son's epileptic death at 3 in 1878. Tragedies that intensified his philosophical wrestling with innocent suffering as the sharpest test of faith, as voiced through Ivan's anguished rebellion against a creator permitting children's torment. Yet these pains paradoxically reinforced his vision of Christianity as embracing the absurd and painful for resurrection's sake. His public life culminating in the 1880 speech's triumphant call for Russia's universal humanistic destiny, bridging ideological divides in ecstatic oratory. While private decline accelerated through emphysema rooted in Siberian hardships, pulmonary possibly worsened by inheritance disputes over aunt's estate, or the tense atmosphere of nearby revolutionary activities preceding Tsar Alexander II's assassination. His final moments on February 9, 1881, quoting's parable of the grain dying to bear abundant fruit, a poignant summation of a life where destruction yielded enduring harvest, buried amid tens of thousands at cemetery. His legacy spanning existentialism's forebears like who learned psychology from him, his parricidal analyses, Camus, and absurd confrontations, polyphonic innovations revolutionizing narrative, translations into over 170 languages, museums, celestial namesakes, and ongoing debates over his stances on Judaism, socialism, and feminism. Complexities veiled yet inviting endless rediscovery, where ancient echoes of ecstatic auras akin to illumination. Dualistic soul struggles, redemptive suffering, interlace with one man's luminous torment, whispering across time of the human capacity to glimpse light through the deepest darkness. A quiet invitation to reflect on our own concealed abysses and unexpected graces in the stillness of night. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the resonant toll of monastery bells blended with the distant howl of steppe winds that once carried the war cries of golden horde riders, moved through existence as though guided by an invisible compass pointed toward the hidden chambers of the human heart. his life slowly disclosing truths that appeared to reach across centuries, perhaps to the silent prayer of hesychast monks who, in darkened cells, repeated the Jesus prayer until the uncreated light flooded the inner person, or to the ancient debates of theologians who wrestled with how a good God could permit a world so saturated with innocent pain, questions that would inherit not as abstract doctrine, but as lived anguish and ecstatic interruption, as we continue this gentle, unhurried descent into the layers of his story, lingering again on the epilepsy that marked him so distinctly. For these seizures were not merely a medical burden, but a strange portal, especially in their rare ecstatic prelude, moments when, for perhaps 5 or 10 seconds, the ordinary fabric of time and space dissolved into overwhelming serenity, luminous clarity, an almost unbearable fullness of being in which he felt himself fused with infinite harmony, a sensation he later attempted to capture through Prince's halting confession in The Idiot. That in those instants, all questions were solved, all contradictions reconciled, all doubts dispelled. A rapture so complete that he would willingly trade the rest of his life for one such second, yet the price was immediate and merciless. Convulsions, loss of consciousness, foaming at the mouth, bodily injury from falls, postictal confusion and exhaustion that could last hours or days, episodes that grew more frequent in his later decades, sometimes striking several times a month, often at night, leaving him to wake bruised and disoriented in a room that smelled of blood and fear. And though physicians of his era offered little beyond leeches, cold baths, and vague prescriptions of bromide or zinc oxide, modern retrospective analyses suggest temporal lobe epilepsy with ictal asystole or bradycardia in some attacks, the ecstatic aura likely originating from firing in limbic structures, particularly the insula and amygdala, regions that orchestrate visceral emotion. And the sense of self, giving rise to the eerie conviction that the veil between ordinary reality and a higher order had been momentarily torn, experiences that cannot be reduced to pathology alone, but invite comparison with mystical accounts across traditions. Plotinus's sudden flights to the One of raptures, the Sufi whirling dervish's annihilation in divine love, yet always returned these visions to the realism of orthodoxy, insisting that any genuine encounter with the divine must pass through the crucible of flesh, history, and moral choice, rather than bypass them in pure spiritual escape. A conviction that sharpened his critique of both materialist rationalism and escapist mysticism, his gambling compulsion forming another shadowed current, one that erupted with particular violence during the 1862-1867 European years when, often traveling alone or with before Anna's stabilizing presence, he would enter the gaming rooms of Wiesbaden, Baden-Baden, Homburg, or Saxon, sit at the roulette table, and play with a desperate, almost ritualistic intensity, staking not merely money but dignity, health, future security, losing sums that represented entire novel advances, pawning watches, coats, Anna's lace and dresses, even her wedding ring on more than one occasion, driven by the gambler's classic delusion that the next spin, the next number would reverse the tide and restore equilibrium, only to stagger back to rented rooms in shame, write frantic begging letters to publishers and relatives, then channel the humiliation and self-disgust directly into fiction, most transparently in The Gambler, dictated at white heat in 26 days to Anna in 1866 to meet a punishing contract deadline and stave off debtor's prison. A novella that dissects the psychology of addiction with merciless precision, the alternation of euphoria and despair, the superstitious rituals, the way chance becomes a substitute god when faith falters. Yet the compulsion persisted intermittently even after marriage, diminishing only gradually in the 1870s as domestic responsibilities, Anna's prudent management of their finances, and perhaps a deepening sense of vocation outweighed the pull of the wheel. His correspondence and notebooks revealing repeated vows to quit, broken promises, cycles of remorse, and a persistent moral self-examination that mirrored the underground man's spiteful defiance and tormenting conscience, turning private weakness into universal inquiry into the nature of will, freedom, and the irrational foundations of human. While these personal abysses deepened, so did the familial griefs that punctuated his middle and late years. The death of first wife Maria from consumption in 1864, after years of coughing blood and mutual recriminations. Brother, abrupt collapse from liver disease the same year, leaving a widow, children, and crushing magazine debts that fell largely on shoulders. The brief life and agonizing death of infant daughter in Geneva in 1868 from what was likely hydrocephalus or meningitis. Her tiny body carried in a zinc coffin across Europe because Swiss law forbade burial of non-citizens without exorbitant fees. The loss of 3-year-old son to epilepsy in May 1878, an attack witnessed by both parents as the boy convulsed and never regained consciousness, a mirror image repetition of his own affliction that plunged him into days of mute despair and intensified the theodicy question that burns through Ivan's conversation with. How can one accept a world order in which children suffer, in which the tears of one innocent child are not enough to justify the harmony of the whole? Yet even here refused easy answers, portraying faith not as intellectual resolution, but as an act of defiant love that kisses the hem of the garment even while the mind rebels, a position rooted in his reading of the Book of Job, the gospel passion narratives, and the orthodox emphasis on kenosis, the self-emptying of God into human vulnerability, themes that find their fullest expression in the Brothers, the novel he regarded as his artistic and spiritual testament. Published in installments from 1879 to 1880, a vast polyphonic tapestry in which the voices of sensualist, intellectual atheist, Ivan, saintly novice, and their bastard half-brother collide around patricide, courtroom drama, theological disputation, and the quiet miracle of active love. The Grand Inquisitor chapter standing as one of the most devastating critiques of authoritarian religion ever written, yet framed within a narrative that ultimately affirms the possibility, fragile, costly, never guaranteed, of choosing Christ in full awareness of the world's absurdity, his public life reaching a brief, luminous summit with the speech delivered on June 8, 1880, in Moscow before an audience of literary and cultural luminaries, an oration that celebrated as the supreme embodiment of Russia's capacity for universal sympathy and brotherly embrace. Calling on the intelligentsia to bow before the people's truth and participate in the nation's messianic vocation to reconcile East and West in a higher Christian humanism. Words that provoked tears, prolonged ovation, and temporary reconciliation between hostile ideological camps. Though the harmony proved fleeting and critics soon pointed out the speech's idealistic gloss over social contradictions, his health, however, offered no such respite. Emphysema contracted in Siberian cold and aggravated by Petersburg dampness, recurrent pulmonary, episodes of breathlessness that forced him to bad EMS for the mineral waters in 1874, 1875, 1876, and 1879, each trip yielding temporary relief, but no cure, the final decline accelerating in late 1880 and early 1881 amid domestic tensions over the disposition of Aunt's estate. The strain of editing and financial pressures, and perhaps the ominous atmosphere created by the arrest of members in nearby apartments, revolutionaries whose bomb plots would soon claim Tsar Alexander II's life, on the evening of February 8, 1881, after a violent quarrel with his sister-in-law or stepson over money, or simply after a day of ordinary fatigue, a major began, blood pouring from mouth and nose, Anna summoning doctors who applied ice, leeches, and attempted tamponade while he grew steadily weaker, conscious almost to the end, asking Anna to read the parable of the prodigal son, and then the passage from about the grain of wheat that must fall into the earth and die to bear much fruit, whispering to her that he had always loved her passionately and never betrayed her even in thought, then slipping quietly away in the early hours of February 9, January 28, by the old calendar, at the age of 59. His body laid out according to custom, surrounded by candles and icons, the funeral procession drawing between 40 and 100,000 mourners from every class and confession, students carrying his coffin shoulder-high through the streets to the cemetery of the Alexander, where it rests near the Gravov, and beneath a simple stone bearing the Johannine verse on the grain that dies, a life whose every wound and glimpse of light became part of a vast, unfinished conversation about what it means to be human in a world both beautiful and unbearable, a conversation that still murmurs in quiet rooms and sleepless nights, wherever people open his pages and allow themselves to be unsettled, moved, and perhaps, against all probability, consoled. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the low murmur of vespers from distant monasteries mingled with the ceaseless rustle of birch leaves under endless winter skis, carried on as if every breath were both a protest against and an embrace of the world's contradictions, his days unfolding in a slow, inexorable rhythm that seemed to draw nourishment from the very things that wounded him most deeply: epilepsy's sudden lightning, gambling's fevered mirage, grief's long grey aftermath. Each one becoming, in retrospect, another brushstroke in a portrait of the soul that refuses simplification. As we settle once more into this quiet, unbroken telling, returning to the texture of his later years, when the man who had once been condemned to death now found himself, improbably, a figure of national reverence, yet still pursued by the same inner demons that had shadowed him since youth, his marriage to Anna. Begun in 1867 amid the chaos of creditors and European exile, gradually hardened into the one stable axis around which the rest of his existence turned, Anna proving not merely a devoted wife, but a shrewd business manager, stenographer, editor, and protector who shielded him from the worst consequences of his impulsiveness, keeping meticulous household accounts, negotiating with publishers, selling editions of his works from their own apartment when necessary, even traveling ahead to secure affordable summer dachas in where the mineral springs and pine-scented air offered temporary relief from Petersburg's damp chill and his worsening emphysema, a partnership marked by genuine affection, yet not without its strains, her youth and practicality sometimes clashing with his mercurial temperament, his occasional jealous suspicions, the relentless pressure of debt that forced him to write at a punishing pace even when illness made concentration agony. Their 4 children, and the lost, representing both joy and piercing sorrow, his death from epilepsy at 3 in May 1878, perhaps the single deepest cut, the boy inheriting his father's malady in a form so virulent that he never recovered from the seizure, a loss that left silent for days, wandering the apartment like a man searching for something irrecoverably gone. The event feeding directly into the composition of the brothers, where the suffering of children becomes the fulcrum of Ivan's metaphysical revolt, the question posed with merciless clarity: if the tears of one tortured child are the price of cosmic harmony, is the harmony worth accepting? Yet does not allow Ivan's anguished logic to stand unanswered. Instead, he places beside its quiet practice of active love small, concrete acts of compassion that refuse to wait for theoretical resolution, a response rooted less in argument than in lived witness to the possibility that grace can still move in a broken world. His final major public moment arriving on June 8, 1880, with the speech delivered in Moscow at the unveiling of the Poets' Monument in Boulevard, an event organized by the Society of Lovers of Russian Literature that drew writers, critics, officials, and students from across the empire, speaking without notes in a voice that trembled with emotion, portraying as the supreme Russian genius precisely, because he possessed an unparalleled capacity to enter into the spirit of every people and culture: Arab, Jew, Western European, Slav, absorbing them into something universally human. Then turning the address into a prophetic call for Russia's intelligentsia to humble itself before the truth carried by the common people, to cease preaching imported utopias, and instead join in a shared Orthodox Christian path toward universal brotherhood. Words that provoked tears in the hall, spontaneous embraces between ideological enemies, Slavophiles, and conservatives and radicals, several listeners reportedly falling to their knees, the ovation lasting 20 minutes. Yet the euphoria proved fragile. Within days, critics accused him of sentimental idealism and dangerous Slav chauvinism, while others saw in the speech a momentary illusion of unity that could not survive the empire's deepening fissures, himself returning to Petersburg both elated and exhausted, the speech perhaps the closest he ever came to a public apotheosis, though he remained acutely aware that acclaim could not heal the body or silence the doubts that still visited him in the night. His emphysema progressing relentlessly, forcing repeated trips to the spas at Bad Ems, where he drank the bitter waters, inhaled moist air, and rested as best he could while continuing to write letters, revise proofs, and plan the continuation of the Brothers beyond its serialized conclusion, the final arriving in the first days of February 1881, possibly precipitated by a heated family argument over money or inheritance, or simply by the cumulative strain of a lifetime of overwork, cold, grief, and seizures, the bleeding beginning suddenly on the evening of the 8th, bright arterial blood filling basins than cloths could staunch it. Doctors summoned in the small hours applying ice packs, leeches to the neck, attempting to tamponade the bronchus, while Anna held his hand and their children watched in terror from the doorway, conscious enough to ask for the gospel. Listening as Anna read the parable of the prodigal son, and then 3:14:15 on the fulfillment of righteousness, managing to whisper to her that he had loved her passionately and faithfully in thought and deed, then fadding quietly toward dawn on February 9, January 28, by the Julian calendar, at 59, the room growing still except for the crackle of candles and the muffled weeping of those gathered around the bed, his body washed and laid out in orthodox fashion. Icons placed at head and feet, the funeral 3 days later drawing an immense crowd. Estimates range from 40 to 100,000. Students unharnessing the horses to pull the coffin themselves through the snow-covered streets to the Alexander, where it was interred in the cemetery beside the grave of earlier literary giants. The tombstone later inscribed with the words from John 12:24. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. An epitaph that captures with uncanny precision the paradox at the center of his life. That everything most precious in his work, compassion for the insulted, refusal of cheap consolation, insistence that love must be tested in the fire of real suffering, emerged not despite his personal ruin, but because of it, the grain falling, dying, and multiplying beyond anything the suffering man could have foreseen, leaving behind a body of work that still speaks with startling directness to anyone willing to sit with its discomforts, its contradictions, its sudden shafts of light. A voice that does not solve the mystery of existence, but insists that the mystery is worth bearing, worth questioning, worth loving through to the end. A quiet, persistent summons that continues to echo in the small hours when the world grows still, and the heart remembers its own hidden wounds and unsuspected capacities for grace. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the soft glow of vigil lamps in countless icon corners flickered against the long polar nights, and the brief, aching brightness of white summer dawns, persisted as a man who seemed to carry the weight of centuries within his frail body. Every convulsion, every lost, every fresh grave adding another layer to a consciousness that refused to look away from the full spectrum of human reality, its exaltation and its degradation, its capacity for cruelty and its stubborn, improbable tenderness. As we drift once more into this calm, unbroken recounting, allowing the narrative to settle like snow over familiar ground, yet always revealing new contours under closer gaze. Consider how the final decade of his life, despite the mounting physical toll, became paradoxically the period of his greatest public presence and artistic concentration. A time when the once mocked monk Photius of the engineering school days was transformed, in the eyes of many, into a living oracle of the Russian soul. His monthly A Writer's Diary serving as a kind of secular sermon that reached tens of thousands of subscribers across the empire, blending sharp social commentary, literary criticism, personal confession, prophetic visions, and fervent advocacy for a distinctly Russian path that would reject both Western liberalism's atomized individualism and revolutionary socialism's mechanistic collectivism, in of an organic, orthodox-inspired, conciliar unity rooted in mutual love and shared suffering, essays that sometimes veered into troubling territory. As when he expressed suspicion toward Jewish influence in finance and journalism, or celebrated the Turkish War of 1877-78 as a holy struggle to liberate Balkan Slavs and restore Constantinople to Christian hands, positions that reflected the pan-Slavic fervor of the era, yet also exposed the limits of his universalism, the way even a mind so attuned to the insulted and injured could harbor blind spots and prejudices inherited from his time and class. Nuances that later readers would wrestle with uncomfortably, refusing to sanitize them, yet refusing equally to let them eclipse the profound moral seriousness that animates nearly every page he wrote. His domestic routine in those years settling into a rhythm of intense morning work, often beginning at dawn after a night broken by seizures or breathlessness, followed by reading newspapers aloud to Anna, walks along the Neva, or in the summer garden when weather permitted. Evenings spent correcting proofs or receiving visitors who ranged from awestruck students to established writers to high officials, including occasional audiences with members of the imperial family who sought his counsel on moral and educational questions. Conversations that flattered, yet never fully satisfied him, because he sensed the gulf between abstract sympathy and the lived experience of the insulted and injured whose voices he had carried out of Omsk and into literature. The speech of June 1880, remaining the brightest flare of that late public recognition, delivered in a Moscow hall thick with heat and expectation, his voice unsteady at first from nerves and fatigue, yet gaining strength as he spoke of Protean gift for empathy, the poet's ability to become an Arab in the imitation of the Koran, a medieval knight in ballads, a skeptical Western intellectual in, then pivoting to the larger claim that Russia herself, through her literature and her people, was called to perform a similar reconciling role for humanity, to heal the divisions between nations and classes by offering a higher, Christ-centered truth that the West had lost amid its rationalism and materialism. Words that struck listeners like a sudden bell in the silence, provoking sobs, applause that would not stop, reconciliations between men who had spent years vilifying one another. Even if the unity proved ephemeral, and the speech's idealism was soon challenged by those who saw in it either dangerous utopianism or veiled chauvinism, himself returning to Petersburg both uplifted and drained, aware that no single address could close the chasms he had spent a lifetime mapping, his emphysema advancing with cruel inevitability, each winter in Petersburg bringing longer bouts of coughing, blood-flecked sputum, shortness of breath that forced him to pause mid-sentence when reading to the children or dictating letters, the trips to Bad Ems offering only partial reprieve, the bitter, iron-rich waters temporarily easing inflammation, yet leaving the underlying damage untouched, while he continued to plan the unwritten second volume of the Brothers, envisioning a narrative arc in which would leave the monastery, enter the world, and become a quiet force of renewal among the suffering. A plan never realized, yet haunting the completed novel with a sense of open-ended hope, the final striking without clear warning in early February 1881, perhaps after an ordinary day of work, and family tension, perhaps exacerbated by the emotional strain of unresolved estate matters or the pervasive atmosphere of revolutionary conspiracy that hung over the city like smoke, the bleeding beginning violently on the evening of the 8th. Anna desperately pressing cloths to his mouth, while servants ran for doctors, the medical men arriving too late to do more than witness the inexorable weakening, ice applied to the chest, leeches to the mastoid, futile attempts to control the flow as grew paler, calmer, still lucid enough to request the gospel and listen with closed eyes as Anna read the familiar passages, his hand resting in hers, his last coherent words her of his unwavering love and fidelity. Then a gentle fading into silence, sometime before dawn on the 9th, the room lit only by candlelight and the faint winter grey seeping through the curtains, the body prepared according to custom, washed, dressed in clean linen, icons placed at head and feet, visitors arriving through the night and the following days to pay respects, the funeral procession on the 12th drawing crowds that spilled across Prospect and into the side streets, students detaching the horses and pulling the open coffin themselves through ankle-deep snow, a river of black coats and bowed heads following to the cemetery where the grave was dug beside those of earlier writers, the simple stone later carved with the Johannine verse about the grain of wheat that must fall into the earth and die to bring forth much fruit, an image that encapsulates the strange economy of his life. Every collapse, every humiliation, every night spent gasping for air or waking from a seizure in terror became, through the alchemy of relentless attention and unflinching honesty, the fertile ground from which grew a body of work that refuses to let the reader look away from either the abyss or the possibility of light within it. Novels and stories that still feel startlingly contemporary because they speak not from a settled position of wisdom, but from the midst of the struggle itself. Offering no cheap consolations, yet never abandoning the stubborn conviction that compassion, forgiveness, and the choice to love, even when everything in experience seems to argue against it, remain the only responses adequate to the mystery of being human, a legacy carried forward in countless translations, adaptations, scholarly debates, and private midnight readings where individual readers, separated by oceans and generations, still find themselves addressed directly, unsettled, challenged. And occasionally, against all expectation, steadied by the knowledge that someone once looked at the same darkness and did not turn away, but stayed, suffered, wrote, and in doing so left behind a quiet, persistent permission to keep asking the hardest questions while still daring to hope for an answer that might arrive not as argument but as lived presence, as the small, costly acts of love that practices, and that, in his own tormented way, never entirely ceased to believe in. A voice that continues to murmur through time, patient, uncompromising, and strangely consoling in its refusal to lie about either the pain or the possibility. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the faint scent of incense from countless home icons drifted through the long winter evenings, and the soft crunch of snow underfoot marked the passage of time, lived out his final years as a man who had become, almost against his own will, a quiet beacon for those searching for meaning in a century of upheaval. His presence carrying the weight of every ordeal he had endured, while still radiating an almost childlike wonder at the possibility of grace, as we settle deeper into this gentle, unbroken flow of remembrance, allowing the narrative to drift like a slow river through the last chapters of his days. Consider how the years after his return from Europe in 1871 marked a gradual, hard-won settling into a life that balanced public reverence with private fragility. The apartment on Lane in Petersburg becoming both sanctuary and workshop, its rooms lined with volumes in Russian, French, German, and English, the air often thick with the smell of tobacco from his ever-present cigarettes, and the faint metallic tang of blood when a seizure or left its trace, Anna managing the household with extraordinary competence, paying off old gambling debts, handling subscriptions to a writer's diary, overseeing the printing and sale of his books through their own modest publishing venture, while he worked in a small study where the desk was always cluttered with manuscripts, newspapers, letters from readers, and the ever-present New Testament, whose margins he had filled with notes during the Siberian years, mornings beginning early when his health allowed, the sound of his pen scratching across paper the only noise in the house until the children stirred. Afternoons often spent reading aloud to Anna from the day's papers or discussing the latest political tremor, the assassination attempts on the Tsar, the growing radical underground, the debates over judicial reform and the Polish question, conversations that fueled the monthly essays in which he alternately praised the Russian people's enduring faith and warned against the nihilistic poison spreading among the educated youth, essays that sometimes revealed darker currents. His increasingly strident pan, his distrust of Jewish financiers whom he blamed for certain economic woes, his romanticized view of the Russian peasant as the bearer of true Christian humility, positions that reflected the anxieties and prejudices of his time, yet also exposed the limits of his own vision. The way a mind so attuned to the inner contradictions of individuals could still harbor collective simplifications. Yet even in these public writings, there shines the same refusal to accept easy answers that animates his fiction, the same insistence that truth must be wrestled from experience rather than deduced from theory, his evenings frequently interrupted by visitors, young students who came to listen in awe, fellow writers seeking advice, conservative officials hopping to enlist his pen for the government cause. Conversations that could stretch late into the night until a seizure or coughing fit forced him to retire, Anna helping him to bed, placing a cold compress on his forehead, reading to him from the Gospels until his breathing steadied, the marriage itself deepening into a partnership of profound mutual dependence. She the guardian of his health and finances, he the one who, even in exhaustion, could still make her laugh with sudden flashes of, or move her to tears with the intensity of his affection, their 4 surviving children, the eldest daughter who would later write memoirs of her father, the quiet son who inherited his father's name and a portion of his sensitivity, Anna herself, who became the family chronicler and publisher after his death, growing up in an atmosphere saturated with literature, religion, and the constant awareness of their father's precarious health, yet also filled with moments of ordinary joy. Summer stays in where the children played in the garden and walked slowly along the river, breathing the clean air that eased his lungs for a while. Evenings spent telling them stories from his own childhood or reading, aloud in his deep, expressive voice, the speech of 1880 remaining the crowning public moment, a speech he prepared with unusual care, writing and rewriting it in the weeks before the journey to Moscow, delivering it in a hall that seemed to hold its breath as he spoke of Russia's vocation to reconcile the divided family of nations, ending with the famous declaration that the Russian people were ready to say to the world, "We carry in our soul the capacity to unite all the world's divisions," words that brought the audience to its feet in a surge of emotion that felt, for those few minutes, like the realization of a dream long deferred, though himself ever the skeptic of easy enthusiasms. Confided to Anna on the train home that he feared the unity would prove illusory, that the deeper divisions, between classes, between faith and reason, between suffering and indifference, would soon reassert themselves, his health deteriorating steadily through 1880 and into the new year, the emphysema making even short walks exhausting, the more frequent and harder to control. Yet he continued working, revising the Brothers for its separate edition, planning a new novel about a Russian monk who would embody the ideal of active love, sketching notes for further diary entries, receiving visitors who sensed the end approaching yet still came to sit in his presence, to hear him speak in that low, thoughtful voice about God, freedom, and the mystery of suffering. The final crisis arriving without fanfare on the evening of February 8, 1881. after a day that had seemed ordinary, some writing, some reading. A family discussion that grew heated over money or inheritance, when a sudden violent cough brought up bright blood, Anna calling for the doctor while pressing clean cloths to his lips, the physician arriving to find him pale but calm, propped up in bed, the bleeding continuing despite every effort, ice applied to his chest, leeches to his neck, morphine to ease the pain, remaining conscious enough to ask for the gospel. Listening as Anna read the parable of the prodigal son, and then the words from about the grain of wheat that must fall into the ground and die to bear much fruit, his hand tightening briefly on hers as he whispered his love and fidelity, then slipping quietly into unconsciousness sometime before dawn on the 9th, the room filled with the soft weeping of Anna and the children, the doctors in sorrow, the body washed and laid out with candles burning at head and foot, icons placed around him. Visitors arriving through the night, friends, admirers, strangers who had read his words and felt them as a personal address, until the funeral on the 12th, when an enormous crowd gathered, students unharnessing the horses to draw the coffin themselves through the snow-covered streets, a river of black-clad mourners following to the Alexander, where the grave was dug in the cemetery, the earth closing over him beneath a stone that would later bear the verse from John about the grain that dies to bring forth fruit. A life that had begun in the dim wards of a charity hospital and ended in the arms of a nation that had learned to see in him something more than a writer, a witness to the depths of human darkness and the stubborn possibility of light, a man who had looked unflinchingly at the worst in himself and others, yet never abandoned the hope that love, tested in the fire of real suffering, could still redeem, a legacy that lives not in monuments or statues, but in the quiet moments when a reader, alone with one of his books, feels suddenly addressed, challenged, consoled by a voice that knows the full measure of despair, yet still chooses to speak of mercy, of forgiveness, of the strange, costly beauty of being alive in a world that breaks the heart, yet refuses to let it die completely. A voice that continues to murmur through the years, patient and unyielding, inviting each new generation to sit with the hardest questions and still dare to hope for an answer that might come not as thunder, but as the small, persistent flame that refuses to go out even in the deepest night. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the pale winter light filtered through frost-rimed windows and the distant clang of church bells marked the slow turning of hours into days, carried within himself a quiet, unyielding awareness that every moment of existence was charged with meaning, even, or perhaps especially, when meaning seemed most cruelly withheld, his final years unfolding like the last pages of a long, densely written manuscript, in which every line bore the imprint of earlier chapters, yet pointed toward something still unfinished, as we continue this calm, unbroken narration, allowing the story to breathe once more in the stillness that surrounded him toward the end. Picture the apartment in those closing months of 1880 and the first weeks of 1881. The rooms warmed by tiled stoves that never quite banished the damp chill, books stacked on every available surface, Anna moving quietly between kitchen and study with the practical grace of someone who had long since learned to anticipate crises. The children, already a thoughtful adolescent beginning to keep her own diary, young, serious, and observant, playing or reading in the next room while their father worked at the small desk where the lamplight caught the tremor in his hand. The air heavy with the scent of strong tea, cigarette smoke, and the faint metallic trace that lingered after a seizure or a small, his daily routine disciplined yet fragile. Rising when he could, often after a night broken by coughing fits or the sudden electric jolt of an epileptic aura that left him gasping in wonder at the fleeting vision of harmony before darkness rushed in. Then sitting to write or dictate, the words coming in bursts between bouts of breathlessness, revising the separate edition of the Brothers with meticulous care, adding footnotes, adjusting phrasing. Knowing this book would stand as his fullest statement, yet on the questions that had haunted him, since the mock execution on Square. Whether freedom of will is worth the suffering it entails, whether love can survive the knowledge of evil, whether God's silence in the face of a child's tears can ever be justified. His A Writer's Diary, though formally concluded in 1877, lived on in the essays and letters he continued to produce. Pieces that mixed prophetic fervor with piercing psychological insight. One month he might defend the Russian peasant's instinctive orthodoxy against the intelligentsia's imported theories. The next he would dissect a recent crime reported in the papers, tracing its roots not to poverty alone, but to the loss of moral grounding in a society drifting toward nihilism. His tone, sometimes harsh, even xenophobic, when he spoke of Jewish usurers or Polish separatists, reflecting the prejudices of his milieu and the defensive nationalism that grew stronger as he aged. Yet always underneath ran the same refusal to reduce human beings to economic categories or ethnic stereotypes, the same insistence that every individual soul carries the image of God, and therefore infinite worth. No matter how obscured or defaced that image may appear, visitors continued to arrive. Students who had read Crime and Punishment and felt it had spoken directly to their own secret guilt, conservative thinkers who saw in him a bulwark against revolution. Even occasional radicals who came out of curiosity or to argue, conversations that could grow heated yet rarely ended in rupture, because listened with an intensity that disarmed, his questions cutting deeper than any polemic, his own doubts laid bare without shame. The speech of June 1880 still echoed in his mind as both triumph and warning. The memory of the hall rising in tears and applause, men who had spent years in bitter opposition, embracing one another, the sense, for one shining hour, that Russia might yet fulfill a universal vocation of reconciliation, yet also the sober realization on the train back to Petersburg that such moments are fragile, that history does not pause for sentiment, that the real work of unity must be carried out in the small, unglamorous acts of daily forgiveness and compassion. His body, meanwhile, betraying him more openly. The emphysema making each breath a conscious effort. The cough sometimes bringing up threads of bright blood that Anna wiped away with practiced calm. The seizures arriving without pattern. Sometimes mercifully absent for weeks. Sometimes clustering in a single night until he woke bruised and disoriented. The children tiptoeing past the study door when they heard the low moans that signaled an attack had passed. Yet through it all he wrote, planned. Dreamed of the unwritten sequel to the Brothers in which would step out of the monastery into the chaos of ordinary life, carrying the light he had found in cell into taverns, courtrooms, slums. A figure who would not preach, but simply be present, loving without. A vision that remained only notes and fragments, yet carried the full weight of everything had come to believe about redemption, that it arrives not through grand systems or triumphant proofs, but through the stubborn, often clumsy fidelity of one person to another, the final days arriving almost imperceptibly. A slight worsening of the cough in late January, more frequent pauses to catch his breath mid-sentence, a quiet evening on February 8, during which a family discussion, perhaps about money, perhaps about the disposition of an inheritance from a relative, grew unexpectedly sharp. Then the sudden, terrifying cough that would not stop, blood pouring from his mouth in a bright stream, Anna calling servants and doctors while pressing linen to his lips, the physicians arriving to a scene they could not reverse. Applying ice, leeches, morphine, everything their limited pharmacology allowed while the bleeding continued, calm amid the panic, asking for the gospel to be read, listening with closed eyes as Anna's voice carried the familiar words of the prodigal son and the grain of wheat that must fall into the ground and die, his fingers tightening once on hers as he whispered his love, his fidelity, his gratitude, then a gradual softening of the features, the breathing slowing. Stopping sometime in the dark before dawn on February 9, 1881, the room lit only by guttering candles and the first grey light of a Petersburg winter morning, the body prepared with reverence, washed, dressed in clean clothes, surrounded by icons and burning tapers. Visitors beginning to arrive almost immediately, word spreading through the city like ripples across frozen water. The funeral 3 days later becoming one of the largest public gatherings the capital had seen. Tens of thousands lining the streets, students detaching the horses from the hearse to pull it themselves. A silent, black-clad river flowing toward the Alexander, where the earth received him beside earlier masters of the word. The stone later set above the grave, bearing the verse from John that had become almost prophetic. The grain that falls and dies to bear much fruit, a life that had begun in obscurity amid the suffering of the poor, passed through the crucible of near-death and exile, flowered in works that still pierce the conscience of readers across the world, and ended in the arms of those who loved him most, leaving behind not answers, but a way of asking questions so honestly that the asking itself becomes a form of prayer, a refusal to look away from pain or beauty. A stubborn trust that even in the deepest night some small, persistent light continues to burn, waiting for anyone willing to sit with it long enough to see. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the pale glow of kerosene lamps cast long, trembling shadows across wooden floors, and the distant chime of cathedral bells carried through the frozen air like a memory of something almost forgotten, spent his closing months in a state of quiet, almost luminous intensity, as though every breath he drew were both and a prayer. Every sentence he wrote a small act of defiance against the encroaching silence that would soon claim him. As we linger once more in this gentle, unbroken recitation, allowing the narrative to settle like fine dust over the familiar outlines of his last days, imagine the atmosphere in the Lane apartment during those final weeks of January 1881. The rooms warmed unevenly by the large corner stove, its tiles radiating heat in slow pulses while drafts slipped through the double windows, the faint smell of wood smoke mingling with the sharper scent of ink, strong Russian tea, and the medicinal bitterness of the bromide solution Anna measured out each evening to try to quiet the seizures, himself often working propped against pillows in an armchair rather than at the desk when the cough grew too persistent, a woolen shawl draped over his shoulders. His thin fingers stained with nicotine and ink, turning pages of proofs or jotting notes in the margins of his own manuscript with a pencil that trembled only slightly. Anna moving quietly between rooms, bringing fresh tea, adjusting the lamp to reduce glare on his tired eyes, reading aloud from newspapers when his own vision blurred from fatigue or the of an aura, their conversation often turning to small, grounding things. The children's schoolwork, the price of firewood, a neighbor's new baby, yet always circling back to the larger questions that had never left him. Whether the Russian people could still hear the voice of Christ amid the clamor of progress, whether literature could still serve as a bridge between the educated and the simple, whether personal suffering could ever be transfigured into something that redeems rather than merely wounds. His correspondence in those weeks revealing both weariness and an undimmed inner fire. Letters to friends expressing gratitude for past kindnesses, to publishers negotiating terms with unusual patience, to young admirers their questions about faith with a directness that startled them believe in spite of everything. He wrote to one student, "Even when reason tells you all is lost, even when the evidence of your eyes contradicts every hope, believe anyway, because love demands it, and love is stronger than evidence," words that echo the desperate. Defiant faith of characters like an father, yet spoken now not as fiction, but as personal testament, the speech of the previous summer still lingered in his thoughts like an of bright light, its memory of the Moscow audience rising as one, the tears on faces that had once been set against each other, the fleeting sense that Russia might yet become the of nations. Yet he confided to Anna that such moments were dangerous if they bred complacency, that true unity could only be built slowly, painfully, through the daily practice of humility and forgiveness rather than grand oratory, his body meanwhile growing more transparent with each passing day. the emphysema turning every inhalation into a conscious effort, the cough sometimes subsiding for hours only to return with fresh violence, small staining handkerchiefs with alarming brightness, the seizures arriving in clusters that left him dazed and sore. Yet even in the aftermath, he would sometimes speak of the auras with a strange, almost grateful wonder for those few seconds. He told Anna once, after a particularly bad night, "I understand why martyrs could smile at the stake. The joy is so complete, it swallows every fear," experiences that modern neurology would later link to specific patterns of limbic, but which he himself regarded as privileged, if costly, glimpses into the reality faith promises, the children sensing the gravity without fully comprehending it, quietly bringing him drawings she had made, Young sitting silently beside the armchair, holding his father's hand during the worst coughing spells. Anna shielding them as best she could while refusing to leave his side for more than a few minutes, the final evening arriving almost modestly. February 8, 1881, a day that had begun ordinarily enough. Some writing, a walk along the corridor when the weather allowed a brief venture outside. A family conversation that grew unexpectedly tense over money or the inheritance from a distant relative. Then the cough that refused to subside, the sudden gush of blood that soaked cloth after cloth, Anna's calm breaking into urgency as she sent for doctors, the physicians arriving to a scene already slipping beyond their reach. Ice packs pressed to his chest, leeches applied in the old way, morphine easing the raw edge of pain, while the bleeding continued its relentless course, remaining lucid enough through the worst of it to ask for the gospel, listening with closed eyes and shallow breaths as Anna read first the story of the prodigal son returning to open arms, then the passage from about the grain of wheat that must fall into the earth and die before it can bear fruit. His fingers closing weakly around hers as he managed to whisper once more his love, his unchanging fidelity, his gratitude for every shared moment, then a gradual easing, the struggle leaving his face as though some long-held tension had finally been released, the breathing growing fainter until it stopped altogether in the dark stillness before dawn on February 9, the room lit only by the low flames of candles and the first uncertain light of a winter morning creeping through the curtains. The body washed and laid out with the quiet reverence tradition demanded, icons placed at head and foot, candles burning steadily, the children allowed to come and kiss their father's forehead one last time before the visitors began to arrive. Word spreading through the city with the speed of grief, friends, admirers, strangers who had never met him yet felt they knew him through his pages. The funeral 3 days later drawing a crowd that filled the streets beyond counting. Estimates ranging from 40,000 to over 100,000. Students stepping forward to unharness the horses and draw the open coffin themselves through the snow. A vast, silent procession moving like a dark river toward the Alexander, where the earth was opened in the cemetery beside the resting places of earlier literary masters. The simple stone, set above the grave later, inscribed with the verse from John that had become almost prophetic of the life it commemorated. The grain that falls into the ground and dies, yet in dying brings forth much fruit, a life that had begun among the cries of the poor in a charity hospital, passed through the terror of a mock execution and the long darkness of Siberian chains, flowered in novels that still cut to the quick of conscience and spirit, and ended in the presence of those who loved him most, leaving behind not a system or a doctrine, but a way of seeing, unflinching, compassionate, stubbornly hopeful. That continues to speak to anyone willing to listen in the quiet hours when the world grows still, and the heart remembers both its deepest wounds and its undefeated longing for light. A voice that does not promise easy comfort, yet never abandons the possibility that even the most broken existence can become, in ways we cannot fully foresee, the seed of something enduring and good. In the shadowed corridors of 19th century Russia, where the last pale rays of winter sun slipped through frosted panes, and the soft creak of floorboards carried the weight of every step taken toward silence, reached the quiet terminus of a journey that had begun amid the cries of the afflicted in a Moscow charity hospital, and passed through every imaginable depth of human experience: mock execution, Siberian chains, epileptic ecstasies, gambling fevers, grief that carved hollows in the soul, yet never lost its stubborn orientation toward the possibility that even the most shattered life could bear fruit. As we come at last to the gentle, final unfolding of this long narrative, allowing the story to settle into its natural close like snow covering a familiar landscape, until only the essential shapes remain visible. The days immediately preceding February 9, 1881, were marked by a subtle but unmistakable softening. The cough that had become a constant companion grew deeper, more wet, each breath deliberate effort, yet continued to work in small, determined bursts, revising a few lines of proof, dictating a short note to a correspondent, turning once more to the gospel passages he had known by heart since childhood, Anna observing the changes with the practiced eye of someone who had nursed him through countless crises, keeping the children close, yet shielding them from the worst of the sight. The apartment itself seeming to grow quieter, the usual bustle of visitors tapering off as word spread that the writer was failing, friends arriving not to debate or seek counsel, but simply to sit in the same room, to offer a murmured word, a silent witness to the passage they all sensed approaching. On the evening of February, ate a conversation, perhaps over the tangled matter of an inheritance from a relative, perhaps over money still owed from old magazine ventures, grew sharper than intended. Voices rising briefly before falling again into the familiar rhythm of reconciliation. Then the cough returned with sudden violence, blood appearing in bright, alarming quantity, Anna moving swiftly to support him, pressing clean linen to his mouth while servants ran for doctors. The first physician arriving within the hour to find his patient pale, but composed, propped against pillows, the bleeding continuing despite every remedy the medical science of the time could muster. Ice to the chest, leeches behind the ears, attempts at tamponade with gauze, small doses of morphine to dull the raw edge of sensation, remaining lucid through the worst of it, his eyes clear, his voice weak yet steady when he asked Anna to read from the Gospel. First the parable of the prodigal son, with its image of the father running to meet the returning child. Then the passage from 3:14-15, in which righteousness is fulfilled even in the midst of apparent humiliation. His hand resting in hers as she read, fingers tightening once in a final gesture of connection, then whispering, almost inaudibly, his love for her, his fidelity in thought and deed, his gratitude for the life they had shared through every storm, after that a gradual easing. The struggle leaving his features, the breathing growing shallower, more spaced, until it simply stopped sometime in the dark stillness before dawn on February 9, 1881, or January 28, by the old Julian calendar, the room illuminated only by the low, steady burn of candles and the first uncertain grey light seeping around the edges of the curtains, Anna sitting motionless beside him for long minutes before she rose to perform the necessary acts, closing his eyes, straightening the sheet, summoning the children to say their quiet goodbyes, the body washed according to custom, dressed in clean linen, surrounded by icons placed at head and foot, candles lit at each corner, the scent of wax and faint incense filling the space as word began to spread through the city with the speed that grief commands, friends arriving first, then admirers who had never met him, yet felt they had walked beside him through every page, strangers who had read Crime and Punishment or the Brothers in cheap editions, and found in those books something that spoke directly to their own hidden wounds. The funeral arranged for February 12, drawing a procession, unlike any the capital had witnessed, estimates ranging from 40,000 to as many as 100,000 souls. Students stepping forward spontaneously to unharness the horses from the hearse and draw the open coffin themselves through streets lined with silent onlookers. Black-coated figures stretching back block after block, a dark river moving slowly toward the Alexander, where the grave had been prepared in the cemetery beside the resting places of the earth receiving him under a sky that offered neither storm nor sun, but only the pale, indifferent clarity of a Petersburg winter noon. The simple stone, later, set above the grave, bearing the verse from John 12:24 that had become, through repetition and circumstance, almost prophetic of the life it marked. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. And so the grain that was born in obscurity among the suffering poor, condemned to death and reprieved at the last instant, broken by hard and illness, tempted by roulette wheels and lifted by fleeting visions of paradise, widowed, bereaved of children, burdened with debts yet never defeated in spirit, fell into the earth, and in falling, brought forth a harvest that continues to feed minds and hearts across continents and centuries. Novels that refuse to let the reader escape the full weight of human freedom and its consequences, characters whose inner contradictions mirror our own, questions posed with such naked honesty that they still burn after more than 100 years. Whether God can be justified in a world where children suffer, whether love can survive the knowledge of evil, whether the individual soul can ever be truly free in a society built on coercion and illusion, yet always beneath the anguish. The same stubborn refusal to despair, the same quiet insistence that compassion, forgiveness, and the small, costly acts of love practiced in the midst of real pain remain the only responses adequate to existence, a legacy carried forward not in marble monuments or official commemorations, but in the private, midnight encounters between reader and page, in the moment when someone halfway across the world opens the idiot or notes from underground and feels suddenly seen, challenged, consoled by a voice that knows the depths of degradation yet still dares to speak of redemption, a voice that does not offer cheap certainties or final solutions, but instead accompanies the questioner through the dark, refusing to abandon the search even when the path disappears into shadow, reminding each new generation that the mystery of being human is worth bearing, worth questioning, worth loving through to the end, even when the end arrives quietly in the small hours, with nothing left but the sound of a single candle burning steadily against the dark, and the knowledge that somewhere, in the silence that follows, the grain continues its hidden work, multiplying beyond anything the sower could have imagined. This mysterious journey ends here, but stay tuned for more untold stories in our next video. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories.